Everett Voss did not knock. He never knocked. He simply walked into the office of the man who had handled legal matters for half the county, dropped a leather satchel on the desk, and said, in a voice that was almost pleasant, "Tell the Whitmore widow she has 30 days to vacate the property. After that, we remove her ourselves." The attorney looked up. "She hasn't agreed to sell. She doesn't need to." Voss straightened his cuffs. "Her husband borrowed against the land. The note's been purchased. The property reverts." He picked up his hat. 30 days. "Tell her to take what she can carry." He walked out without waiting for a response. He never waited. That was the thing about men like Everett Voss. They had never once in their lives been made to wait for anything. That was about to change. If you've ever been stripped of everything you worked for by someone who simply had more money and less conscience than you, stay with me. This story is for you. Subscribe to the channel so you don't miss what happens next. Hit the like button and drop a comment telling me what city or country you're watching from. I want to see how far this story travels. Now let's begin. Elena Whitmore found out she was homeless on a Tuesday. Not from a lawyer. Not from a formal letter delivered to her door with a wax seal and careful language. She found out because her neighbor, a decent enough man named Harlan Pruitt, rode up to her fence line at 7:30 in the morning while she was hanging laundry, and he took off his hat, and he could not quite look at her directly when he said, "I heard Voss bought the Whitmore note from the bank. Heard he's moving quick." Elena stood there with a wet sheet in her hands. She had known the loan existed. Franklin, her late husband, had told her about it the summer before he died, a frank, uncomfortable conversation at the kitchen table while the coffee went cold between them. He had borrowed against the acreage to cover 2 bad seasons and a broken well pump. The debt was manageable, he said, as long as they stayed careful and the cattle prices held. The prices had not held. And then Franklin had died, quietly and without warning, in the back field one October afternoon, and the careful plan he had built died alongside him. That was 11 months ago. Elena had spent those 11 months doing the work of 2 people. She had kept the books, managed the remaining hands, sold off what she could sell, and paid down what she could pay. She was not finished. She had not been given the chance to finish. She folded the wet sheet slowly, set it in the basket, and looked at Harlan. "How certain is this?" "Certain enough that I rode over here first thing," he said. She nodded once, all right. He waited, as if expecting tears or rage or something he could respond to. She gave him neither. She thanked him for coming, picked up the laundry basket, and went inside. She sat at Franklin's desk, her desk now, and opened the ledger. She looked at the numbers for a long time. Not because she didn't know them. She knew them perfectly. She looked at them because she needed to understand exactly how little room she had left before she let herself feel anything about it. The answer was none. There was no room. The note was called, the loan was in default, and Everett Voss had bought the debt at a price the bank had been glad to accept. She had 30 days. She closed the ledger. Then she sat in the chair and stared at the wall for a while, and she let herself feel it, the full, suffocating weight of it, for exactly as long as she could afford to, which was not very long. After that, she got up and started packing. Elena Whitmore was 34 years old, and she had never once in her adult life described herself as a beauty. Was not cruel about it. She simply was not romantic about it either. She was a large woman, broad-shouldered and heavy, built in a way that made some people look at her with pity and others with contempt. And she had learned years ago that responding to either was a waste of energy she needed for other things. Franklin had loved her exactly as she was. That had been a fact she'd never quite stopped being grateful for, even now, even after. He had been a thin, sandy-haired man with a dry sense of humor and a talent for fixing machinery, and in 12 years of marriage he had never once made her feel like an apology. She missed him with a specific, physical ache that had not dulled the way people promised it would. But grief did not pay debts. She packed 2 bags. She kept the practical things. Her boots, 3 dresses that wore well, her winter coat, the ledger books from the farm because they were hers, and she had kept them, and she refused to leave them for Voss's men to rifle through. She kept Franklin's watch, a small photograph, and a letter he'd written her on their 10th anniversary that she had read so many times the paper had gone soft at the folds. She left the furniture, she left the curtains she'd sewn herself. She left the kitchen garden she had planted in April and was never going to harvest. She paid the 2 remaining hands their last wages in cash from the tin she kept behind the stove. One of them, a boy of about 18 who had worked there since before Franklin died, cried a little and tried to hide it. Elena shook his hand and told him he was a good worker, and that the next man who hired him would be lucky to have him. She meant it. Then she picked up her bags and walked out. She had $63, a battered leather suitcase, and a general sense of the direction in which the nearest town lay. The road was not kind in the middle of July. Elena had known it would be hot. She had not quite accounted for how much the heat would compound the weight she carried, not just the suitcase, but her own body, which was not built for long walks in direct sun. Sweat soaked through her dress within the first mile. Her feet, in boots that fit well enough for farm work, were not made for road walking. She stopped twice to rest in what shade the roadside offered, which was minimal. She drank from her water tin carefully because she didn't know how far the next well was. She did not feel sorry for herself exactly. She felt angry, which was more useful. She thought about Everett Voss as she walked. She had seen him once at the county land office, about 3 months after Franklin died. She had gone to file some paperwork, and he had been leaving as she arrived, a tall, well-dressed man in his mid-50s with silver at his temples and the particular kind of ease that came from never having gone without. He had looked at her the way some men looked at women like her, a brief assessment, a flicker of dismissal, a look that said she was not worth further consideration. She had filed her paperwork. She had gone home. She had forgotten about him entirely. Now she understood that he had not forgotten about her. The farmstead that bordered her land to the south sold 8 months ago, after the Garfield family had 2 seasons of sabotaged fencing and unexplained stock losses. The property to the east had sold 6 months before that. She hadn't connected those sales at the time. Now, walking down a hot road with $63 and nowhere to be, she was connecting them. There was a pattern here. She just didn't have enough of the picture yet to see it clearly. She kept walking. She had heard of Blackthorn Ranch the way everyone in the county had heard of it in fragments over years, from people who spoke of it with a mixture of respect and unease. The ranch itself was enormous, nearly 12,000 acres of grazing land and hardwood timber at the base of the ridge country. It had been in the Rusk family for 3 generations, built by men who had the particular combination of stubbornness and luck that frontier land required. The current owner, Calder Rusk, had taken it over from his father at the age of 26 and had built it considerably since. What people said about Calder Rusk was not about the ranch. It was about the man. He was by all accounts extraordinary in his physical scale. Elena had never seen him in person, but the descriptions she had heard over the years from Harlan Pruitt, from the women at the dry goods store, from the farmhands who occasionally crossed his crew on shared grazing roads were remarkably consistent. He was 6'7", possibly more. His hands were described as the size of dinner plates. His shoulders were described as a doorway. He had once, reportedly, lifted the back end of a wagon out of a ditch by himself because the horses couldn't pull it free. But that wasn't the part that made people speak of him with unease. That part was the grief. Calder Rusk had married a woman named Margaret 8 years ago, and she had died in childbirth 3 years later, and the child had not survived either. Since then, Blackthorn Ranch had existed in a kind of suspended stillness. The cattle ran well. The hands were paid on the time. The fences were maintained. But Calder himself had retreated inside the operation, as if the outer world were something he had decided to be done with. He did not socialize. He did not come to town except when necessary. He had not, as far as anyone knew, entertained a single guest at Blackthorn in 2 years. He lived there alone with his hands in a silence that the territory had learned not to disturb. Elena was about to disturb it, not because she wanted to, because she needed work. She needed a roof over her head. And Blackthorn Ranch was 8 miles from where she'd started walking, while every other option was considerably farther. She was pragmatic about most things. This was one of them. She arrived at the main gate of Blackthorn Ranch in the late afternoon, soaked through with sweat, both feet aching and one heel beginning to blister in a way she was trying not to think about. A ranch hand was mending a section of fence near the gate. He was young, maybe 20, with a sunburned nose and the kind of startled expression that suggested he was not accustomed to women arriving on foot and unannounced. "I'm looking for work," Elena said. "Is Mr. Rusk available?" The young man blinked. He looked at her suitcase. He looked at her face, which was red from the heat and probably not at its best. "Ma'am, Mr. Rusk doesn't generally." "I understand he doesn't generally," Elena said. "I'd still like to ask." Something in her tone apparently settled the matter, because the hand who introduced himself, somewhat reluctantly, as Eli Mercer, told her to wait by the gate and went to find his employer. She waited. She put down her suitcase and stretched her back and looked at the ranch. Even from here she could see it had the bones of something well built. The stable was solid. The fencing ran true. The main house was a large, sturdy structure set back from the road, with a covered porch that ran its full length. But there was a quality of neglect underneath the maintenance that she recognized from the Pruitt place. After old Harlan's wife had died, a kind of functional emptiness. Things kept up because they had to be, but nothing alive in it. She was still looking at the house when the door opened. She had been told Calder Rusk was large. She had not fully processed what that would mean in practice until he stepped off the porch and walked toward her. And her first involuntary thought, was that she had never seen a man that size move like that deliberately, unhurried, with a particular kind of physical confidence that didn't need to announce itself. He was exactly as described, possibly more so. He was in his late 30s, she guessed, a broad, dark-haired man with several days of beard and the kind of face that had probably been younger looking before whatever had aged it. His hands were, in fact, remarkable. She noticed them specifically because they were the hands of someone who had worked hard for a long time, not the hands of someone who merely directed others to work. He stopped about 10 feet from her and looked at her with an expression that was not unfriendly but was absolutely unreadable. "Eli says you're looking for work," he said. His voice was low and measured, the kind of voice that was used to giving instructions without repeating them. "I am," Elena said. "I'm a cook and a bookkeeper. I've managed a household of 6 hands for the past several years. And before that, I kept accounts for my husband's operation. I'm competent in the kitchen, I don't waste provisions, and I can manage records if that's useful to you." He studied her for a moment. "Where's your husband?" "Dead," she said, "last October, heart in the field." "Quick!" A slight shift in his expression. "Not pity, something more complicated than that. Where are you coming from?" "The Whitmore farm. East Road, about 8 miles. She met his eyes because she had decided a long time ago that looking away from things did not make them smaller. "Everett Voss bought my debt and called the note. I had 30 days. I left this morning." He looked at her for a long moment. "You walked 8 miles, he said. "The road doesn't offer other options." He was quiet again. She could not tell if he was deliberating, or if he simply took his time with most things. She suspected the latter. "I had a cook," he finally said. "She left 6 months ago. Her daughter had a baby in Kansas and she went to help." He paused. "The men have been cooking for themselves. That's unfortunate," Elena said. He almost smiled. It didn't quite complete itself, but the movement was there. "You have references?" "Not ones I can produce tonight," she said honestly. "Harlan Pruitt would speak for me. The Garfields would have before they sold. I can give you a week's work and you can decide from that." He looked at her suitcase. He looked at her face. He looked at her with the careful assessment of a man who had learned the hard way to read people accurately. "Room and board while you're here," he said. "If the week works, we'll set a wage." He turned back toward the house. "Eli will show you where to put your things." That was it. No extensive questioning, no negotiation, no remarks about her appearance or her situation, or the fact that a woman had walked 8 miles on a summer afternoon to ask a stranger for a job. She picked up her suitcase. "Thank you," she said to his back. He paused very briefly. "The kitchen's in poor condition. I'll apologize in advance." "You don't need to apologize," Elena said. "I'll deal with it." He walked inside. The kitchen was in fact in poor condition. It was not dirty. Exactly, it was a kitchen used by working men who kept it minimally functional, without much investment in whether it actually worked well. The stove needed cleaning and one burner ran uneven. The dry stores were disorganized, mixed in ways that meant nothing had been properly inventoried in months. The cast iron was seasoned unevenly. There was a crack in one of the smaller work surfaces that had been poorly filled with something that wasn't holding. Elena stood in the middle of it for a few minutes after Eli showed her the small side room that would be hers, and she made a list in her head of what needed to be done and in what order. She started on the stove. Eli, who had clearly expected her to rest after an 8-mile walk in July, appeared in the doorway an hour later and found her on her knees with a rag and a bucket. He stood there for a moment, looking uncertain. "You're going to hurt yourself," he said. "I'm going to clean a stove," Elena said. "These are different things. It's late. Then I'll finish in the morning." She sat back on her heels and looked at him. He was a good-looking boy with an open, earnest quality that she found immediately likable. "How many hands does Mr. Rusk keep on?" "7 regular," Eli said. 2 seasonal that'll come in September." "Do they eat together or separate?" "Together, in the main room. When there's something worth eating." He said the last part with a slight grimace that told her something about what the past 6 months of self-catered meals had been like. "When's breakfast?" 5:30, she calculated. "All right." He watched her go back to the stove. "You're really going to cook tomorrow morning?" "That's what I came here to do," Elena said. He went away and she kept working. She was up at 4. The stove was not perfect, she hadn't had time, but it was operational in the way she needed it to be. She found flour and salt and lard in the stores and made biscuits. She found dried beans that had been soaking since before she arrived, left by someone with good intentions and no follow-through, and she cooked them down with salt pork. She found coffee and made it properly, which meant not weak. By 5:15, the kitchen smelled like something that had not been happening in this house for a considerable time. The hands came in at 5:30. They came in expecting the usual, whatever the usual was, and they stopped almost collectively, just inside the doorway when they smelled what was in the air. It was not a dramatic moment. It was a small one. But Elena noticed it, because small moments of that kind told you a great deal about what the people around you had been going without. She served the biscuits and beans and coffee without comment. The men ate without much comment either, which was the highest form of compliment available in that context. Eli C. sat at the far end of the table and ate 2 helpings and looked at her with the expression of someone who had just revised an opinion significantly upward. Calder Rusk came in last. He poured his own coffee. He was not a man who waited for things to be handed to him and sat at the head of the table with the specific silence of someone who was accustomed to eating alone and had not fully reconciled to the presence of 7 men around him. He ate the biscuits. He ate the beans. He drank the coffee. He said nothing to her directly, but she caught him once, looking at the kitchen with the look of a man noticing that something missing had quietly returned. The first week passed. Elena cleaned the kitchen systematically and improved it incrementally. She reorganized the stores and kept a proper inventory. She adjusted the fire to make the uneven burner behave. She cooked 3 meals a day for 9 people, which was not complicated but required consistent attention, and she gave that attention without making it a subject of comment. She also, in the evenings when the work was done, began reviewing the ranch ledgers. Not because anyone asked her to. Calder had mentioned she was a bookkeeper. She had seen the ledgers in the study. The door had been open once when she passed, and their condition had made her involuntarily wince. She had asked Eli whether Mr. Rusk used an accountant or kept his own books, and Eli had said he thought Mr. Rusk kept them himself but that he wasn't sure how recent they were. She did not march into Calder's study and announced that she intended to review his accounts. She left a note on the desk, formal and brief. If the bookkeeping requires attention, I am available to assist. E. Whitmore, that was on Thursday. Friday evening, the ledgers were on the kitchen table with a note of his own, if it's not too much additional work. She worked on them for 2 hours after dinner, and what she found was not chaos. Calder Rusk was clearly not careless, but it was neglect. There were 6 months of entries that were accurate but not analyzed, which meant that several patterns that should have triggered attention had simply accumulated without anyone looking at them. She made notes. She did not deliver them immediately. She waited until the weekend when the rhythm of the ranch was slightly slower, and left a summary page in the ledger with her findings organized by category and priority. He read it on Saturday. She knew because she heard him in the study for a long time, and when she brought him coffee, the only personal service she had offered since arriving, and only because she was already making it. He looked up at her with the expression of someone encountering competence they had not expected. 3 of these I didn't know about, he said. The seed supplier overcharge has been running for 4 invoices, she said. Small enough not to catch individually. He looked at the page. You found this in one evening. I was looking for it, she said. You weren't. He was quiet for a moment. You said you kept accounts for your husband. 12 years, she said. He was good with land and livestock. Numbers put him to sleep. She almost smiled. We were useful to each other. Something moved across Calder's face at that, a kind of recognition. Or maybe something more private than recognition. He looked back at the ledger. The wage I mentioned, he said. If you want to handle the accounts, as well as the kitchen, it should reflect that. She named a figure. It was fair, and she knew it was fair, and she said it without hedging. He agreed without bargaining. That was the end of the first week. The second week was when the town found out she was there. She had gone to the dry goods store on Wednesday. For provisions, Eli drove her in the buckboard, which was a considerable improvement over walking, and she felt the shift in the air the moment she walked through the door. Not hostility, exactly. More the quality of attention that said word had already traveled. The woman at the counter was polite in the way of someone conducting a transaction with someone they had already formed an opinion about. The woman at the back of the store, who Elena did not know by name but recognized as one of the women who had occasionally attended the same church socials as Franklin's family, did not bother with politeness. She said, in a voice pitched to Carrie, I heard the Whitmore widow talked her way onto Rusk's property. Elena took a list from her pocket and began reading provisions to the woman at the counter. Calder Rusk's hardly left that ranch in 2 years, the woman at the back continued to her companion. And now suddenly he's got a live-in housekeeper. Elena paid for her provisions. I suppose some women know how to make themselves useful, the woman said. Elena picked up her basket. She looked at the woman in the back directly without flinching and said, I suppose they do, and walked out. In the buckboard, Eli said, I'm sorry about that. Don't be, Elena said. She didn't say anything I haven't heard before. He drove for a minute. Doesn't it bother you? Of course it bothers me, she said. That's not the same as letting it change anything. He thought about that for the rest of the drive back. The woman at the back of the store was named Lenora Vane, and Elena learned this when Eli mentioned her name that evening, in a tone that suggested he wished he had thought not to bring it up. She's connected to the county seat, Eli said. with the careful neutrality of someone describing a snake. Her family has money. Her husband's on the territorial council. Does she have particular feelings about Blackthorn Ranch? Eli looked at the table. She had a particular feeling that when Mr. Rusk eventually stopped grieving, he would be available. He cleared his throat. That was the general understanding. Elena considered this. And now she's reconsidered, something like that. She poured herself more coffee. All right, you're not worried? I'm the cook and accountant, Elena said. What she thinks about that is her own business. But she filed the information. Lenora Vane, connected to money in the Territorial Council with a specific interest in Calder Rusk's future. It was the kind of fact that had no relevance yet and would later turn out to matter considerably. It was near the end of the second week that Calder Rusk spoke to her at length for the first time. Not about work, about something else. She had been in the kitchen late. She was often the last one up, and she heard him come down the stairs, which she had learned meant he was not sleeping. She poured a second cup and left it on the table without comment and went back to the accounts. He sat down across from her. He looked at the ledger for a moment, then at her, with the look of a man who wanted to say something and had not decided yet how to begin. The farm, he said finally. How long did you work it? 12 years married, a year alone, she looked up. 11 months and 3 days precisely. And Voss moved on the debt. He bought it from the bank and called it immediately. She set down her pen. I've been thinking about that. I made payments not full, but regular. A bank will generally work with you on partial payments if the debt is being serviced. They sold the note instead. Banks sell notes. Not always at that speed, she said, and not always to the same buyer twice in 6 months. She watched him. Do you know who sold to Voss before me? A pause. The Garfields. Yes, and before them. He looked at her differently now. You're thinking there's a pattern. I'm thinking there might be, she said carefully. I don't have enough information yet. He drank his coffee. He looked at the table. He said after a moment, I had an offer on Blackthorn. 3 weeks ago, she waited. From Voss, he said. A substantial one, and you refused. I refused. He said it with the finality of a man who had not spent more than 30 seconds deliberating. Blackthorn Ranch was not a negotiation item. It was simply not available. That was the end of the conversation as far as he was concerned. But Elena understood now what the next chapter of that refusal might look like. Voss did not accept no. She had proof of that in the blisters still healing on her feet. He'll push harder, she said. I know, she looked at him across the table. He was a large man sitting in a kitchen at midnight drinking coffee, and he looked tired in a specific way that had nothing to do with physical work. He looked tired the way people looked when they had been holding things together alone for longer than was sustainable. I want to keep looking at the records, she said, not just Blackthorn's. If there are patterns in how Voss operates, they'll be findable. Banks keep records, land offices keep records. She paused. Will you let me? He looked at her for a moment. A real look, the kind that was actually seeing something. Yes, he said. She went back to her accounts. He sat at the table for a little while longer, not drinking his coffee particularly, and then he said, out of nowhere and very quietly, the biscuits this morning were better than anything that's been made in this kitchen in about 3 years. She did not look up. The stove's cooperating better. That's not what I meant. She did look up then. He was already standing, taking his cup to the counter. His face was turned away. But there had been something in those words that was not about biscuits, and she understood it for what it was. A man acknowledging very carefully that something was less empty than it had been. She went back to her work. The kitchen lamp burned until well past 1 in the morning, and outside the territory was dark and hot and full of things that were just beginning. The gossip did not arrive all at once. It came the way bad weather came to that part of the territory, slowly. At first, a distant rumble that a person could almost convince themselves was something else, and then all at once it was on top of you, and there was nowhere to go. Elena heard most of it secondhand, through Eli, who had the particular misfortune of being young and honest in a way that made it difficult for him to decide between protecting her feelings and telling her the truth. He generally chose the truth, which she appreciated even when it was uncomfortable. They're saying you positioned yourself deliberately, Eli told her one morning, about 3 weeks after her arrival, while she was rolling dough, and he was supposed to be repairing tack, but had drifted into the kitchen, the way he often did when he had something on his mind. That you walked out here on purpose. I did walk out here on purpose, Elena said. 8 miles of purpose. They mean he stopped. I know what they mean. She pressed the heel of her hand into the dough. They mean I calculated that a widowed man with money and no cook was a better prospect than finding honest work elsewhere. He said nothing, which was its own kind of confirmation. And what do they say about Mr. Rusk in all this? She asked. That he's not thinking clearly because of the grief. Eli picked at a loose thread on the tack he wasn't repairing. That a woman like you, in a situation like yours, would know how to take advantage of that. She kept working the dough. Her hands were steady. A woman like me, he had the decency to look at the floor. I'm just telling you what's being said, I know. I'm not angry at you for saying it. She shaped the dough into rounds and set them to rise. Is Mr. Rusk aware of what's being said? I think he's aware. He doesn't seem to care, she said. Because neither do I. And she meant it mostly. There was a small and stubborn part of her that did care, that had always cared, that had spent 34 years developing the precise skill of not letting the caring show. That was a different thing from not caring. But it was sufficient. She wiped her hands on her apron and went to check on the stove. Lenora Vane came to Blackthorn Ranch on a Friday. She did not come alone. She brought 2 women with her friends, or people who performed the function of friends, which was not necessarily the same thing, and they arrived in a polished buggy at mid-morning when Calder was out with 2 of the hands, checking the south fence line. Elena answered the door. Lenora Vane was a handsome woman, the kind of handsome that was very carefully maintained, somewhere in her mid-40s with dark hair, arranged in a way that suggested considerable time and a personal mirror. She wore town clothes that were too elaborate for a casual ranch visit, which meant this was not a casual ranch visit. She looked at Elena from the doorway for a moment before she spoke. You must be the housekeeper, she said. I'm the cook and accountant, Elena said. Can I help you? We've come to call on Calder. Lenora smiled the particular smile of a woman who had decided in advance how a conversation was going to go. He's an old family friend. I try to look in on him. He's out with the hands. I can let him know you came by. We'll wait, Lenora said, and walked in. Elena stepped aside because the alternative was a physical confrontation in a doorway, and she had better things to do with her energy. She showed them to the front room and offered coffee, which Lenora accepted with the manner of someone receiving what was owed to her, and went back to the kitchen. Eli appeared at the back door approximately 2 minutes later, because word traveled fast on a ranch where everyone was paying attention. She's here, he said. I'm aware, Elena said. She poured the coffee into the good cups. They were in the same cabinet as the ordinary cups. She had simply never used them before and put them on a tray. Do you want me to go get Mr. Rusk? He'll come back when he comes back, Elena said. It's not an emergency. She brought the coffee in, poured it without ceremony, and returned to the kitchen. She could hear Lenora and her companions talking in the front room, with the particular brightness of people performing a pleasant social call for the benefit of whoever might be listening. She paid it approximately the same attention she paid the wind. Calder came in an hour later through the back, pulling off his gloves. He stopped when he saw Elena's expression not dramatic, just informational, and she said, Mrs. Vane is in the front room. She's been here about an hour. Something moved across his face. Not quite annoyance. Something more resigned. How many did she bring? 2 others. I don't know their names. He stood there for a moment with his gloves in his hands and the look of a man who was calculating exactly how long this was going to take and whether there was any alternative. Then he went in. Elena listened without intending to, because the house was not large and voices carried. She heard Lenora's voice shift when Calder entered, warmer, lighter. The social performance adjusted immediately for its intended audience. She heard Calder's voice, courteous, careful, giving nothing. I was worried about you, Lenora said. We all were. You've been so isolated out here. The ranch keeps me occupied, Calder said. Of course it does. But a man needs more than work. A pause, loaded with something. I notice you've taken on new staff. I have a cook and an accountant, Calder said. Both useful. Another pause. It seems a rather particular arrangement. A woman living on the property. I've had hands living on the property for 15 years, Calder said. That's how ranches work, Calder. Lenora's voice dropped into something more private, a register Elena had not heard her use before. I only say this as someone who cares about your reputation, and hers people will talk. You know how people are. I do know how people are, Calder said. Then perhaps Mrs. Whitmore does her work, and does it well, Calder said. His voice had not changed in volume or tone, but something in the quality of it had shifted, the way a large and quiet animal shifted its weight before it decided to move. I won't be making changes to my staff arrangements based on what people say in town. There was a silence. Of course, Lenora said, still pleasant, still smooth. I only meant I appreciate you coming by, Calder said. It was the most definitive version of a conversation being ended that Elena had ever heard delivered without a raised voice. The visit ended shortly after. Elena was at the kitchen table with the ledgers when Calder came through. He poured himself coffee without speaking, stood at the window for a moment, and then said, without turning around, I apologize for that. You didn't bring her here, Elena said. No, he was quiet for a second. Lenora Vane involves herself in things that aren't her concern. She's been doing it for years. She seems like a woman who's accustomed to getting what she wants. Yes. Elena turned a page in the ledger. Is she going to be a problem? Calder turned around and looked at her with the expression of a man who was deciding exactly how much to say. She has her husband's ear, and her husband has the ear of 2 council members. She's not without influence, but she hasn't actually done anything yet. No, he said, not yet. He took his coffee and went back to work. Elena looked at the ledger but did not read it for a moment. She had the feeling, specific and uncomfortable, of a door closing somewhere. Not here, not yet, but in the distance. The sound of something being set into motion by people who thought they were untouchable. She went back to the numbers. The letter arrived 2 weeks later. It came addressed to Calder through the county land office, which meant it had been deliberately routed to carry official weight, and it accused Elena Whitmore of theft. Specifically, it claimed that Elena had removed money and valuables from the Whitmore farmstead before vacating the property, that the debt had not covered the full value of what Voss's acquisition team had found missing when they'd taken possession. It was signed by a lawyer Elena had never heard of, representing interests that were described only as the acquiring party. Calder read it at the breakfast table. His expression did not change significantly, but his stillness deepened in the way it did when something had engaged his full attention. He handed it to Elena without comment. She read it. She read it twice. Her hands were steady. "This is fabricated," she said. "I know. I took my personal belongings in 2 suitcases. The hands were present when I left. Harlan Pruitt saw me go." "I know," he said again. "I'm not asking you to defend yourself." She set the letter down. "Then why are you giving it to me?" "Because you should know it exists, and because you'll want to respond to it carefully." He looked at her across the table. "Do you have documentation of what you took?" She almost said no. What person inventoried their own possessions when they were leaving a home under duress? And then she stopped, because she had in fact written down what she packed. Not as a legal precaution, just because she was a woman who wrote things down, who kept lists the way other people kept photographs. She had done it sitting at Franklin's desk on the last morning, not fully knowing why, just needing the shape of an organized thought before the chaos of walking out. "I have a list," she said slowly, "in my personal notebook." Calder looked at her. Something shifted in his face, not quite surprise, but its adjacent neighbor. "From the day you left?" "Yes." He was quiet for a moment. "That's useful." "I didn't know it would be." "No," he said. "But it is." He drank his coffee. "There's a lawyer in the county seat. Decent man, not connected to the territorial council. I'll write to him today." She looked at the letter lying on the table between them. It was a piece of paper. It was also a declaration of a particular kind of war, the kind that used official channels and legal language, and the assumption that the person being targeted didn't have the resources to respond. Voss had made the same assumption he always made about people who had less than him. He was going to have to revise it. The second letter was worse. It came 3 days later, also through official channels, and it contained an insinuation so ugly that Elena read it standing at the counter and had to stop and breathe for a moment before she could finish it. The letter suggested, in the careful language of a man who knew how to imply things without technically stating them, that there were questions surrounding the circumstances of Franklin Whitmore's death, that a man who had died in a field alone with no witnesses might warrant further inquiry, that a wife who had subsequently lost the property and sought immediate shelter with a wealthy man might have motivations worth examining. It did not accuse her, it simply asked questions. It was in some ways worse than an accusation. An accusation could be answered. Questions of that kind just hung in the air and rotted. She set the letter down. She stood in the kitchen for a moment, and she felt something she did not often allow herself to feel at full strength: rage. Not the productive kind, not the kind that turned into action. The raw kind, the kind that came from somewhere so deep and personal that it was almost physical. Franklin had been a good man. He had worked himself to exhaustion for that land and that life. He had died doing it, alone in a field, of a heart that had always run a little uneven. The doctor had noted it years before. To take that quiet, undramatic death and make it into something sinister. To use the memory of a man who couldn't defend himself as a weapon against his wife. She did not cry. She picked up the letter, folded it precisely, and put it with the first one in the folder she had started keeping in the drawer below the accounts. Then she went to find Calder. He read it in the study. She watched his face while he read, and what she saw there was not anger exactly. It was something colder and more controlled than anger, which she thought was probably more dangerous. "He's trying to destroy your credibility before you can do anything with what you know," Calder said. "Yes. And he's doing it through official channels, which means any response we make looks defensive." "Yes." She sat in the chair across from him. "He's also watched what happened with the other families. They all responded individually. They hired individual lawyers, filed individual complaints, and individually didn't have enough to threaten him. He's not worried about one person." Calder looked at her. "He should be worried about one person," she said. but he's right that one person isn't enough. He set the letter on the desk. What are you thinking? I'm thinking I need to look at the Garfield sale records and the Pruitt records if Harlan will share them, and whatever other property transactions Voss has been involved in over the past 4 years. She leaned forward slightly. The pattern I can see from here is only part of it. If there's a fraudulent survey in the Whitmore property records, and I believe there is, there will be others. And if there are others, there will be a name attached to them. You think he's using false surveys to establish the value of the land he's targeting, or to undermine the value of a competitor's land? She thought it through as she said it. If a survey report says your land has bad water or poor drainage, the bank becomes reluctant to extend credit. If you're already in debt, a bad survey can tip the scales. She looked at him. Has anyone ever surveyed Blackthorn? He was quiet for a moment. 3 years ago. Man came out, said he'd been hired by the Territorial Land Authority for a routine assessment. His expression tightened. I didn't hire him. I thought it was standard practice. Do you still have the report? He opened the bottom drawer of the desk without speaking and produced a folder. She took it. She read the first 2 pages and stopped. Calder, she said. This report describes drainage problems in the north grazing section. I know. I thought it was wrong, but I couldn't prove it. The north section is where your best spring water comes from. Yes, he said, it is. She looked at the name on the survey report. Orson Vale, licensed territorial geologist. She wrote the name down in her notebook. It took her 4 days to find the Garfield survey through Harlan Pruitt, who had kept in touch with the Garfields after they'd sold and relocated to the eastern part of the territory. Harlan was a methodical man, a keeper of papers, and when Elena explained what she was looking for and why, he spent an entire afternoon going through his own correspondence and produced a letter from the Garfields that referenced their survey by name. Orson is the same name. She wrote to 2 other families she knew of who had sold to Voss in the past 3 years. Only one wrote back in time to matter, but the answer confirmed it. Orson Vale. She sat at the kitchen table with 3 survey reports spread in front of her: Blackthorns, the Garfields, and a copy the second family had sent, and she went through them line by line, the way she went through ledgers, looking for discrepancies, looking for patterns, looking for the kind of thing that was not visible until you put the pages side by side. She found it on the second day. 2 paragraphs. Not identical, exactly someone had changed a word here, moved a clause there. But the structure was the same. The rhythm of the sentences was the same. The particular way of describing soil composition, a phrase about lateral water dispersion, that was specific enough to be unusual, appeared in both the Garfield report and the Blackthorn report, describing different properties, written in different seasons of different years. Nobody who wrote genuinely different survey reports used the same unusual phrase twice in the same structural position. She sat back in her chair. The surveys were not just fraudulent in their findings. They had been written from a template. Someone had produced them in bulk, adjusting the property-specific details while keeping the scaffolding identical, which meant Orson Vale was not a geologist who had made bad assessments. He was either a fiction entirely or a name attached to a system that had been producing false documents for years. She went to find Calder. He was in the stable, doing something with a harness that required the kind of patient attention to which he was naturally suited. He looked up when she came in. She put the 3 pages on the fence rail in front of him and pointed to the 2 paragraphs. He read them again. His jaw tightened. The same report, he said, the same template. At minimum. He looked at her. How many properties has he surveyed? I don't know yet. Those are the 3 I have. But if the pattern holds, she did not finish the sentence because the math was uncomfortable. If Voss had been doing this systematically for 4 years, across a territory where land values were increasing and banks were nervous about extending credit to properties with unfavorable geological assessments, the number of affected families could be considerable. We need to find out if Orson Vale is registered with the Territorial Land Authority, Elena said. A licensed geologist has to be on record. How do we do that? I write a letter, she said, formally, requesting verification of licensure. She looked at him. It's a public record request. They have to respond. He looked at her with that expression she had begun to recognize, the one that was not quite surprise, but was its near neighbor, and she realized he had not been accustomed in his life to someone who moved this methodically through a problem. Write the letter, he said. She was already walking back to the house. The fences were cut the following Thursday. Not all of them. 3 sections of the east boundary, which was enough to let 40 head of cattle wander through 2 neighboring properties before anyone noticed. 2 of the hands spent an entire day rounding them up, and by the end of it, Calder had a fine to pay for livestock trespassing and a business relationship with one of the neighboring ranchers that had become considerably cooler. Elena watched Calder when he came in that evening. He was controlled about it, she had noticed. He was controlled about most things. That rage in him went inward rather than outward, but there was a quality in his stillness that she read accurately as something very close to the edge of his patience. "This is the second time in 6 weeks," she said. He had told her, when she first arrived, about the previous incident, a section of fence near the water access that had been cut over the winter. He had attributed it to weather and board drifters. "I know. It's not random," she said. "No," he said. "It's not." He sat down at the table. He was not a man who showed exhaustion easily, but she could see it in the way his shoulders settled when he stopped carrying them deliberately. He was tired. Not from the day, from something longer than the day. "I turned down the offer," he said, "not for the first time. And now things break." "Yes," she said, "that's how it works." She set a plate in front of him because he had not eaten and it was late. "Voss doesn't have a legal mechanism to force you out of Blackthorn while you're current on your taxes and your fences are standing. So he makes you not current and makes your fences not stand." Calder looked at the plate. "You're saying he'll keep doing this until I can't afford not to sell? Until you're desperate enough to see selling as relief instead of loss?" She sat down across from him. "That's the whole mechanism. He doesn't force anyone out. He makes staying feel impossible." He looked at her across the table for a moment. "The livestock contract I mentioned," he said. "The one that was supposed to renew this spring." She waited. "The buyer backed out last week. Said he'd received information suggesting Blackthorn's water quality was unreliable. Referenced a geological report." She felt it land with the specific weight of confirmation. Orson Vale's report. He didn't name it directly, but yes. She sat with that for a moment. Voss wasn't just using the surveys to suppress property values with banks. He was using them with business contacts, with buyers, with anyone whose commercial relationship with a targeted family could be disrupted. The survey was a tool with multiple functions, and he was using every one of them. "I need that letter back from the Territorial Land Authority," she said. "It's been 10 days. I'll write a follow-up." She stood up. "He's not going to stop. Which means we have to move before he makes it impossible for us to." Calder ate his dinner and watched her go back to the kitchen, and she could feel his eyes on her back, not in the way that had made her uncomfortable in other places, other times, with other men. In the way of someone watching something and noticing, maybe for the first time in a while, that they did not want it to stop. The Territorial Land Authority's response arrived on a Monday morning. Elena opened it at the kitchen table while the breakfast things were still being cleared, and she read it twice, and then she set it very carefully on the table and put both her hands flat on the surface and looked at the wall for a moment. Eli was in the kitchen. He saw her face. "What is it?" "Go get Mr. Rusk," she said. He went. Calder came in from the yard, still wearing his gloves, and he read the letter over her shoulder. And the quality of silence that followed was the specific kind that arrives when something you suspected is confirmed in writing, and the confirmation is somehow still a shock. The Territorial Land Authority had no record of a licensed geologist named Orson Vale. The name did not appear in the registry. It had not appeared at any point in the past 20 years. There was no license issued, no examination passed, no registration on file. Orson Vale was not, as far as the territorial government was concerned, a person who existed in any official capacity. Every survey report bearing that name, including the one sitting in Calder Rusk's desk drawer, the one that had told the bank that Blackthorn's north section had drainage problems, the one that had cost him a livestock contract, had been produced by someone who was either using a fictitious name or had fabricated credentials wholesale, which meant the surveys were not just inaccurate, they were fraudulent. Deliberately, provably, criminally fraudulent. "He's been filing false documents with the Territorial Land Authority," Calder said. His voice was very level. "Yes," Elena said, "for years. At minimum 4, possibly more." She looked at the letter. "This is not just civil. This is criminal. Land fraud. Filing false documents with a government authority. And given what it's done to people's finances and livelihoods," she stopped because she was getting ahead of herself and she needed to think clearly. "Can we use this?" Calder said. "Not alone," she said. "We have 3 survey reports and a letter from the authority confirming the name isn't registered. That's the foundation. But Voss's lawyers will argue it's a clerical error, an oversight, a misunderstanding. They'll produce a backstory for Orson Vale that takes months to unravel." She stood up. "We need the other families," she said. "Everyone Voss has targeted. If we go to court separately, we're 1 complaint each. If we go together with 30 survey reports from a non-existent geologist across 4 years of systematic targeting," she looked at Calder directly. "That's not an oversight. That's a conspiracy." He looked back at her. "You want to organize them," he said. "I want to try." She picked up the letter. "You have standing in this territory that I don't have. You're a Rusk. Your family has been here for 3 generations. People will come if you ask." She met his eyes without looking away. "Will you ask?" It was not a small thing she was asking. She knew it was not a small thing. Calder Rusk had spent 2 years carefully reducing his contact with the outside world to a functional minimum, keeping his grief inside the boundaries of his property, keeping himself from the kind of engagement that required him to be present in his own life. She was asking him to ride back into all of it. He was quiet for a moment. A real moment, not a polite pause. "Which families?" he said. She exhaled slowly. "The Garfields, if they'll travel. The Pruetts Harlan has records. There's a family called the Denbys, east of the ridge, who I believe lost water access through a survey dispute last year. And at least 2 others I've identified through the land office records." She looked at him. "Eli can help me write the letters today if you'll put your name on them." He pulled off his gloves. He set them on the table. He stood there in the kitchen of the house where he had been living like a ghost for 2 years. And he made a decision that was larger than it appeared. "Write the letters," he said. "I'll sign them." The week that followed was not clean or straightforward, because nothing that involved other people's fear and pride ever was. The Garfields wrote back quickly. They had relocated, but they had not forgotten. And the anger in the letter their eldest son wrote was the contained kind that had been waiting for an outlet. Harlan Pruett needed 2 conversations and the physical evidence of the matching survey paragraphs before he committed. And even then he was nervous in the way of a man who understood that taking on a wealthy and connected adversary had consequences that did not end with a court decision. The Denbys took a week and sent their nephew to Blackthorn to look at the documents in person before they agreed. 2 other families did not respond at all. Elena did not take it personally. She understood it. Fear was not irrational. Voss had resources and connections, and a demonstrated willingness to use both against people who could not easily absorb the damage. Asking someone to stand up and expose themselves to that was asking something significant, and people who said no to it were not cowardly. They were calculating the cost against what they could afford. She was asking the ones who could afford it to stand for the ones who couldn't. Calder rode out personally to the Denby farm, which she had not asked him to do, and which he did without announcing it in advance. He came back in the evening and said the Denbys were in, and there was something different in him when he says it at something that had been gone from his face for a long time and was beginning, carefully and unevenly, to return. It was not happiness exactly. It was engagement. The particular quality of a man who had stopped being present in his own life and was piece by piece coming back to it. Elena noticed it. She did not say anything about it. Some things were better left to grow without comment. It was Eli who found the second piece. He had been helping Elena organize the survey documents, sorting, comparing, cataloging, and he had developed the particular focused attention of a young man who understood that what they were doing mattered. He was not educated in the formal sense, but he was sharp, and he had the useful habit of looking at things from angles that trained accountants did not naturally take. He came to Elena on a Wednesday evening with 2 documents and a look on his face like a man who was not quite sure what he'd found. "These 2, he said, laying them side by side. "Look at the date." She looked. The Garfield survey was dated March of the previous year. The Denby survey was dated the following September, 6 months apart, and she said, "And the Garfield place is 40 miles from the Denby place," Eli said. "Different land, different terrain, different water table. I heard Mr. Denby's nephew talking about his property, and I know enough about land to know they're nothing alike. So why do both reports say the same thing about the groundwater depth?" He pointed to a specific line. "Not similar, sir, the same. Word for word. The number, the measurement, the description." He looked at her. "You'd have to go out to both properties and get the same measurement for that to be right. And they're nothing alike." Elena looked at the line. He was absolutely correct. She had been comparing structural paragraphs, narrative language, the bones of the documents. She had not gone line by line through the technical measurements because she was not a geologist and had not thought to question the numbers specifically. Eli, who had grown up on land and knew what groundwater looked like in different terrain, had caught what she'd missed. She looked up at him. "Good," she said. It came out with more weight than the word normally carried. He straightened slightly, trying not to show how much that one word meant to him. She wrote it into the record that night. The matching technical measurements, the impossibility of 2 different properties in different geological zones producing identical groundwater readings, the confirmation that whoever had written these reports had not visited the properties at all. The file was growing. It was not enough yet, but it was getting there. And Voss, wherever he was, had no idea that a widow who had walked 8 miles with a battered suitcase and $63 was building the thing that was going to dismantle him. She kept working. She always kept working. That, in the end, was the thing that neither Voss nor Lenora Vane nor the women at the dry goods store had understood about Elena Whitmore. She did not stop. The file Elena had been building now occupied an entire leather satchel that she kept under the bed in her small side room, because the kitchen table was no longer large enough to hold it flat, and the study felt like Calder's space in a way she had not yet stopped respecting. She had organized it by family, then by date, then by document type, and the organizational system was precise enough that she could locate any specific page within 30 seconds. She knew this because she had timed herself, twice, on evenings when she was too tired to work productively, but too wound up to sleep. The response from the Territorial Land Authority had confirmed the central fact. Orson Vale did not exist. But confirmation of a fact and proof of a conspiracy were different things, and Voss's lawyers she had learned through Harlan Pruitt that he kept 2 attorneys on permanent retainer, both well-regarded, both expensive would argue the distinction aggressively if this ever reached a judge. What she needed was not just the fraudulent surveys. She needed to show mechanism, intent, a chain of events that demonstrated these were not isolated errors but a coordinated system, and that the system led directly to Voss. That was harder. She had been working on it for 11 days when the first threat arrived that was not a letter. It came in the form of a man Elena did not recognize, riding a horse she had never seen, who appeared at the Blackthorn gate on a Tuesday afternoon while Calder was in town at the bank, and most of the hands were at the south pasture. Eli was in the barn. Elena was hanging laundry in the side yard when she heard hoofbeats on the road slow and stop. She came around the side of the house and found the man sitting on his horse at the gate, looking at the property with the particular quality of attention that was not admiration. He was somewhere in his 40s, broad through the chest, wearing trail clothes that were too clean for a man who had actually been on the trail. He saw her. "Is this Rusk's place?" he said. "It is," she said. He looked at her for a moment in the way that men who operated for Voss seemed trained to look at her, the quick assessment, the dismissal, and then the second look when the dismissal didn't quite settle right. "Got a message for the owner. Mr. Rusk isn't here." "I can take a message. It's not that kind of message." He looked at the house, at the barn, at the length of the property as it ran toward the tree line. "Just tell him some things are easier when people make reasonable decisions early." He looked back at her. "And some things get harder the longer a man waits." He turned his horse and rode back the way he'd come. Elena stood in the yard and watched him go until the dust settled. Then she's inside and wrote down his description: height, build, horse color, and markings, the direction he'd ridden from in the back of her notebook, with the time and date. She did it immediately, while the details were still precise, because she was a woman who had learned that the details that seemed least important in the moment were often the ones that mattered later. When Calder came back that evening, she told him. She gave him the notebook and let him read it. He read it without speaking. His jaw was doing the thing it did when he was controlling something larger than his expression wanted to contain. "This is escalating," he said. "Yes," she said. "Which probably means we're closer to something than he's comfortable with." He set the notebook on the table. "Or it means he's running out of patience." "That too," she said. "Both can be true." He looked at her. "Are you frightened?" It was a direct question, and he asked it directly, which she appreciated. She thought about it honestly before she answered. "Yes," she said. "Some. But fear and stopping are different things." He held her gaze for a moment. There was something in his face that was not quite what it had been 3 weeks ago. Some quality of seeing her that was more specific than it had been at the start. She noticed it and did not reach toward it because there was too much else to manage, and because she had been wrong about things she'd been certain of before. "We need to move faster," she said, "whatever we're going to do." "The families are still organizing," he said. "I know, but he's not waiting for us to be ready." She found the connection to Voss's corporate interests on a Thursday, buried in a property transfer record that the county land office had released in response to a formal records request she had filed 3 weeks earlier, and then half forgotten about. The record was dry as dust, a chain of title transfers for a parcel of land 20 miles east of Blackthorn, passing through 3 different holding companies over 6 years. Under normal circumstances, it would have meant nothing to her. But she had developed over the past weeks the particular habit of reading land records the way she read ledgers, not for the surface information, but for the structure underneath. The third holding company in the chain had a registered agent. The agent's name appeared in a footnote she almost missed because it was in smaller type than the surrounding text. The name was not Voss, but she had seen it before. It had appeared in the correspondence attached to the letter accusing her of theft, the lawyer's name, the one who had signed the document on behalf of the acquiring party. He was Voss's attorney. She was certain of it, certain enough that she pulled the letter from the satchel under her bed and compared the signatures side by side. Same man, same law firm if you read the embossed letterhead carefully, which meant the holding company that had acquired land 20 miles east was connected to the same legal apparatus that had sent threatening letters to Elena Whitmore and purchased the Whitmore debt and facilitated the acquisition of at least 3 other properties in the territory. The holding company was a shell, and Voss was inside it. She worked until 2 in the morning, making sure she had it right, checking the chain 3 times, making notes in the margins of her notebook, in the careful handwriting she used when she was thinking rather than writing for an audience. When she was satisfied, she sat back in her chair and felt the specific exhaustion of someone who has been carrying a weight for a long time and has just found the edge of something solid to set it on. She knocked on the study door at 7 the next morning, before breakfast, which was unusual enough that Calder opened it with a look of someone expecting bad news. She put the documents on his desk. The holding company that acquired the Fenner land east of the ridge, she said. It's connected to Voss through his attorney. Same legal representation. She pointed to the footnote, to the signature, to the letterhead. He's not buying properties through his own name because his own name would create a pattern that's too visible. He's using corporate structures to obscure the connections. Calder looked at the documents. He looked at her. Can this be proven in court? Not definitively, not yet. But it corroborates the pattern, and it gives a lawyer something to pull on. She sat down. Calder, he has been doing this systematically. The surveys, the debt purchasing, the shell companies, this is not opportunism. This is a design system. He built it deliberately over years. The scale of it sat between them for a moment. How many properties? Do you think, Calder said? I don't know. Enough that he felt safe. Enough that he didn't expect anyone to look at all of them together. She looked at her hands on the desk. He expected each family to fight their own battle alone, because that's what people do when they're scared and don't know the whole picture. Calder was quiet for a long moment. We need a lawyer. A good one, not connected to any of this. Harlan knows a man in the territorial capital, Elena said. Not county level, territorial. Someone who operates above the level where Voss has his connections. Set it up, Calder said. She nodded and stood to go. Elena. He said her name in a way he had not used before, not Mrs. Whitmore, not the careful formality of the early weeks. It was just her name with a weight to it that was not professional. She turned. This thing you've built, he said. He looked at the documents on his desk. What you've done here, I want you to know I see it. She stood in the doorway for a moment. I know, she said, and she went back to make breakfast. The hay barn caught fire on a Saturday night. Elena was awake. She was often awake late, and she smelled it before she heard anything. A specific smell, not the ordinary wood smoke of the house stove, but something larger and faster, the acrid bite of something burning that was not meant to burn. She was at the window within seconds. The hay barn was fully involved on the south side. In the dark, the flames were enormous, orange-red against the black sky, and even from the house she could feel the heat of it as a distant pressure against her face. She shouted. She did not think about it or calculate it. She simply shouted, loud enough that the sound came from somewhere below conscious decision, and she was out the back door and running before the echo of it had finished. Eli's room was above the tack storage at the east end of the barn. She knew this because she had been inside that barn 100 times, and she knew its layout the way she knew the kitchens. The east end, the loft access on the left side. The window above the tack room that Eli had once left open during a rainstorm and apologized about for 3 days. The hands were coming out of the bunkhouse. Someone was ringing the bell that hung near the stable gate. Calder came out of the house at a run, and Elena met him in the yard, and she said, Eli's room is in the east end, and she watched his face, absorb that information in real time. He didn't stop moving. He went straight to the barn at a run, and Elena went after him because she was not a woman who stood in yards while other people ran toward danger, and the heat hit her at 20 feet like a wall. The south side was a solid curtain of flame, but the east end was still partly clear. The fire was moving fast with the dry summer air pushing it, but it had not yet reached the east wall completely. Calder went through the east door. Elena stood at the doorway and could see inside smoke and heat, and the orange light of the fire moving along the loft floor with terrible speed, and she could hear him calling Eli's name. And for 30 seconds that felt like considerably longer, there was no answer. Then there was. Eli's voice came from above, coughing, disoriented, the voice of someone who had been asleep and had woken into something his brain had not yet fully processed. He was at the top of the loft ladder, and the ladder was already hot, and the section of loft floor between him and the east door access was beginning to go. Calder went up the ladder. Elena watched from the doorway, unwilling to go further because she understood, clearly and without self-deception, that her presence inside would be one more person for someone to carry out, rather than one more person who could help. She watched him climb a ladder in a burning building, a man of his size, moving with a speed and deliberateness that she had not seen in him before, as if the grief and the caution and the careful restraint of the past 2 years had been stripped away, and what was underneath was simply a man who was not going to let a boy die in a fire. He reached Eli. He got him up. He came down the ladder with one arm around the young man and the other on the rungs, and the loft was fully burning by the time his boots hit the ground. They came out of the east door at a run. Elena got out of the way. They cleared the door and Eli collapsed in the yard, coughing violently, and Calder went down on one knee beside him, and the other hands were there immediately. Eli was alive. He was burned on his forearm. He had clearly reached for something on his way out, probably instinct, and his lungs were full of smoke. But he was conscious, and he was breathing, and he was going to be all right. Calder was not entirely all right. He had sat back on his heels in the dirt beside Eli, and Elena saw it before he did his right hand. The one that had been on the ladder had a burn across the palm that was serious enough to make her breath catch. He had not mentioned it. He was possibly not fully aware of it yet, the way people were sometimes not aware of injuries until the emergency was over and the body began its accounting. "Your hand," she said. He looked at it. His expression was not dramatic. It was the expression of a man who had been hurt before and who understood that the pain was going to catch up with him shortly. "It's all right. It's not all right," she said. "Sit down." He sat down in the dirt because he was already there, and the argument was not worth making. She got water and clean cloth from the house and came back and knelt in the dirt beside him and looked at the burn. It was across the palm and the base of 3 fingers, red and beginning to blister already, and it needed more than she could provide properly, but she could do something with it now, tonight, before anything else was decided. She worked on it carefully, cleaning it, wrapping it, and he was very still while she did it in the way of a man who was used to dealing with pain by going quiet. Around them, the hands were running water from the well in a chain that they all understood was not going to save the barn but might save the stable. The barn was a loss. The east side, where Eli had been sleeping, was already collapsing. "Someone set it," said one of the hands. His name was Carver, the oldest of the regular crew, a compact and weathered man who did not make statements without cause. He had been around the south side with a lamp, and had come back with a look on his face that settled the question before anyone asked it. South wall. The way it started and the way it moved. Nobody said anything for a moment. Calder looked at his wrapped hand. He looked at the barn. He looked at Eli, who was propped against the fence with a wet cloth on his face, breathing more easily now. "In the morning," Calder said, "you're going to tell me exactly what you saw and where." Carver nodded. Elena finished wrapping the hand. She tied it off and sat back on her heels in the dirt, and she looked at Calder's face in the firelight, the barn still burning, the night still hot and bright with it, and she understood something that she had been moving toward for weeks without letting herself look at it directly. This was not going to resolve itself quietly. Voss had moved from legal threats to physical ones, from letters to arson, from professional attacks to a burning building with a boy inside it. Whatever they had been building with their documents and their letters and their careful file in the leather satchel, it needed to move faster now, because the next time, the calculation on Voss' side of things would be larger. 3 days after the fire, Calder was shot. It did not happen at the ranch. It happened on the road between Blackthorn and the county seat, where he had ridden to file a report on the arson with the territorial marshal's office. Elena had not gone with him. She had been meeting with Harlan Pruitt at the Pruitt property to go through additional documents, and she found out when Eli rode to meet her at a speed that told her something was wrong before he opened his mouth. "He's alive," Eli said first, which was the most important word in the sentence. "He's at Dr. Holt's in town. Left shoulder, he got himself there." Elena was in the saddle before Eli finished. The doctor's office was a frame building on the main street of town, and when she arrived, Calder was sitting in a chair with his shirt off and his left shoulder wrapped in bandaging that was already showing red at the edge. And Dr. Holt, a small, precise man in his 60s who had the tired eyes of someone who had seen too many of the wrong things, was telling him to stay still in the tone of a man who knew that telling Calder Rusk to stay still was optimistic. Calder looked up when she came in. She looked at him for a moment. The bandaging at his face, at the particular set of his jaw that was pain-controlled rather than pain-absent. "Who?" she said. "I didn't see them clearly." "2 men from the tree line. Marshall has the report." "The marshal who is on the territorial council that Lenora Vane's husband sits on?" A pause the same. She sat down in the chair across from him. "How bad?" "It went through," he said. "Clean exit. Holt says if I don't do anything stupid, it heals." Define stupid. He looked at me when he said it. Dr. Holt from across the room made the expression of a man who was not going to confirm that but was not going to deny it either. She looked at Calder's face. He looked back at hers. Something passed between them in that look, not a conversation exactly, but an acknowledgement of what had just happened, of what it meant, of the fact that they had now moved from a legal dispute over land and surveys into something that put people in chairs with bullet holes in them. "You should have taken someone with you," she said. "You should have been here," he said. And then, in a slightly different voice, as if he had not planned to say it, "I didn't realize how much I'd gotten used to having someone to come back to. The room was quiet for a moment. Elena looked at the window. "We can't keep responding," she said. Her voice was steady. "Each time he does something, we respond to that specific thing. The arson, the shooting, the fences. We're always a step behind because we're reacting. What do you propose?" "We take everything we have to a judge," she said. "Now, not when it's perfect. Now, with what we have." She looked at him. "Harlan's attorney in the capital, the territorial one. Has he been contacted?" "I wrote him last week." "Write him again today." She stood up. "And I'm going to write to the other families tonight. Because whatever we're waiting for the perfect document, the complete file Voss is not going to give us the time to find it." She looked at Calder. "He just showed us he's willing to put a bullet in someone. That changes the timeline." Calder was quiet for a moment. He looked at his shoulder. He looked at her. "Get the letter written," he said. "I'll sign it from here." She went. The response from the families was not uniform, and it was not immediate, and it was not without complication. Because that was how things worked when real people with real fear were involved. Harlan Pruitt came to Blackthorn 2 days after the shooting, ostensibly to bring supplies, but genuinely to assess the situation with his own eyes. He walked around the burned foundation of the hay barn, and he looked at it for a long time, and Elena let him look without rushing him, because she had learned that Harlan needed to see things physically before they became real to him. "You shot at Calder on the open road," Harlan said. "Yes." "In daylight, late afternoon." Harlan turned and looked at her. He was a man in his early 60s, solidly built, with the face of someone who had spent his life outdoors, and the eyes of someone who had thought carefully about most things he'd encountered. "Elena, that's not a warning anymore. That's a man who's decided he's untouchable." "I know. What are we walking into if we stand up with you in court?" She answered him honestly, because he deserved honesty, and because dishonesty at this stage would cost more than the truth. "I don't know exactly, but I know what we're walking into if we don't." He looked at the burned foundation again. "The Denbys in?" he said. "Yes." "Garfield's?" "Their son is coming. The family is too far to travel, but he has their documents and their authority to represent them." Harlan was quiet for another moment. Then he said, "You know what the hardest part is?" She waited. "I keep thinking about my wife, about what she would have said about all this." He looked at the sky. "She was braver than me by a considerable margin. She always said the only thing worse than the fight was living with what you didn't do." He put his hat back on. "All right, we're in full." Elena released a breath she had not entirely been aware of holding. "Thank you, Harlan." "Don't thank me yet," he said. "Thank me when Voss is standing in front of a judge trying to explain how a dead geologist surveyed 6 properties." The attorney from the territorial capital arrived at Blackthorn 10 days later, on horseback, alone, which told Elena something about him before he opened his mouth. His name was Thomas Garvey, and he was not what she had imagined from Harlan's description. He was perhaps 50 slight, with the kind of stillness that was different from Calder's stillness. Not the stillness of contained strength, but the stillness of a mind that was always working behind a quiet face. He shook Elena's hand like he meant it. He shook Calder's hand and looked at the sling and did not remark on it. He sat at the kitchen table and looked at the leather satchel Elena set in front of him and said, "Let's see what you have." She talked him through it for 3 hours. She had organized it in presentation order, the Territorial Land Authority letter first, establishing that Orsonvale did not exist. Then the 3 survey reports with matching paragraphs and identical technical measurements. Then Eli's comparison of the groundwater readings from different geological zones. Then the corporate structure connecting the shell company acquisitions to Voss's attorney. Then the timeline of events at each targeted property, showing the pattern of debt purchasing, survey disruption, commercial sabotage, and eventual acquisition. Garvey did not interrupt much. He read carefully, asked occasional precise questions, and made notes in a hand she could not read from across the table. When she finished, he sat for a moment, looking at his own notes. "The surveys are your strongest element," he said. "The non-registration of the geologist is publicly verifiable, and the matching language is damning once you know to look for it." He tapped the page with his pen. "The corporate structure is more complicated. Connecting a shell company to Voss through his attorney is suggestive, but a good defense lawyer will argue that an attorney can represent multiple clients. But if the same attorney signed the letters threatening me," Elena said, "and also appears as registered agent for the holding company, and also handles Voss's other business." "It builds a picture," Garvey said. "It's not proof of conspiracy on its own, but it's part of a picture." He looked at Calder, the arson and the shooting. "Has the marshal pursued any investigation?" "Not meaningfully," Calder said. "Garvey wrote something. That becomes relevant if we can show the inaction was connected rather than incompetent." He looked at Elena. "How many families do you have prepared to testify?" 4 definitively. "Possibly a 5th if we give them another week." He nodded, "The more the better. Individual incidents can be explained individually." A pattern across 5 families over 4 years, all pointing to the same surveys, the same debt mechanism, the same corporate acquisitions that's harder to explain away. He closed his notebook. He looked at both of them. "I want to be honest with you," he said. "Voss has money and connections and very good lawyers. Filing this will make him move against you harder before it gets better." He looked at Calder's shoulder. "I don't know how much harder, we know," Elena said. "You're willing to proceed." "We're willing to proceed," she said. She glanced at Calder. He gave the slight nod of a man who had made his decision and did not need to revisit it. Garvey looked at them both for a moment, with the expression of a man recalibrating something. "All right," he said. "I need one more thing. I need someone to formally request, through proper territorial channels, that Orson Vale appear before the Land Authority to verify his credentials." He looked at Elena. "If he's summoned officially and fails to appear, or if Voss's team tries to produce someone to impersonate him, that becomes contempt and potentially fraud against the territorial government directly." Elena understood immediately. "We're not just building a civil case. I want criminal referral to be available," Garvey said. "Fraud at this scale with forged government documents should not end with a fine and a handshake." "How long to file?" Calder said. 2 weeks to prepare properly. 3 to be sure." He looked at Elena. "Can you write a clean summary of the full timeline? Chronological, factual, minimal interpretation? I'll use it as the foundation document." "I can have it to you in 5 days," she said. He looked at her the way people sometimes looked at her when she told them something they had not expected, not quite disbelief, but a recalibration. 5 days is fine," he said. She started writing it the same night, after dinner, after the hands had gone to the bunkhouse and Calder had gone upstairs, and the kitchen was quiet except for the lamp and the sound of her pen. She wrote for 4 hours before she stopped, and when she stopped it was not because she had run out of things to say, but because her hand ached and her eyes were losing their focus. She put the pen down and looked at what she had written. 31 pages, the beginning of something that was going to take everything they had built over the past months and carry it into the formal machinery of the territorial court system, where it would either hold together or fall apart. She gathered the pages carefully. She thought about Franklin briefly, the way she did sometimes late at night, not with the acute grief of the first months, but with the quieter ache of something that was always there underneath everything else. He would have had a dry comment about all of this. He would have said something about a woman who walked 8 miles with a broken suitcase and wound up filing territorial fraud charges, and he would have said it with the specific dry humor that had always been his particular form of admiration. She allowed herself the thought for a moment. Then she set it aside and put the pages in the satchel. There was still more to do, and she was not finished. Garvey had been right about one thing with absolute precision. Filing the case made things worse before they got better. The formal request arrived at Voss's attorney's office on a Wednesday. By Friday, 2 things had happened that told Elena they had struck something real. The first was that Calder received a visit from a man who introduced himself as a representative of the Territorial Council's Land Oversight Committee, an office Elena had not known existed until that moment, who spent 40 minutes asking careful questions about Blackthorn's water rights and tax records in a tone that was polite and thorough, and completely without legitimate cause. The second was that a letter arrived at the county marshal's office, copied to the territorial court, formally accusing Elena Whitmore and Calder Rusk of filing fraudulent claims, interfering with legitimate business operations, and conspiring to defame a respected member of the territorial business community. Voss had filed first. Elena read the accusation at the kitchen table with Garvey, who had stayed at Blackthorn rather than returning to the capital, because he had anticipated exactly this. He read it with the expression of a man who had seen the move before and had already prepared for it. "He's trying to invert the case," Garvey said. "Make you the conspirators and him the victim. It's a standard response when someone with resources gets cornered early." "Can it work?" Elena said. "It can create delay. It can damage credibility with people who only hear the headline." He set the letter down. "It won't hold in front of a competent judge because the evidence runs in exactly the opposite direction. But it will make the next few weeks uncomfortable." Uncomfortable was a significant understatement, as it turned out. The accusations were reported in the county newspaper within 3 days, which meant that by the following week, every family in the territory who paid attention to such things had read a version of the story in which Elena Whitmore was described as a displaced widow who had manipulated a grieving landowner into filing false claims against a prominent businessman. Calder was described, in language that was careful enough not to be actionable, as a man whose judgment had been compromised by prolonged isolation and personal loss. It was precisely targeted. Elena understood that. Voss or his lawyers had identified the 2 most vulnerable points, her social standing and Calder's grief, and had built the counter-narrative directly on top of them. She did not go to town the week the article ran. Not because she was afraid to, but because she had work to do, and the work was more important than proving something to people who had already decided. Calder went to town. He went on the Thursday when the article had been out for 4 days and the talk was at its height, and he rode in alone on a morning when the main street would be busy. Elena found out from Eli, who had been in town for supplies and had watched the whole thing from the feed store doorway. He rode to the newspaper office first, Eli said. He was trying to be neutral about it and not entirely succeeding. Went in, talked to the editor for about 15 minutes, came out. Then he went to the land office and filed 3 additional records requests, all formal and public. He paused. Then he stopped in front of the general store. It was busy. A lot of people around. And he talked to about 6 or 7 men he knew, loud enough that people nearby could hear. What did he say? Elena said. He said that Mrs. Whitmore had been employed at Blackthorn for 8 weeks, that she had identified financial irregularities in his accounts that had saved him considerable money, that she had organized the survey evidence that formed the basis of the territorial filing, and that anyone who had questions about her character or motivations was welcome to come to Blackthorn and look at the documentation themselves. Eli stopped. He said it like he was stating the weather. Not angry, just factual. Elena looked at the window. Did anyone take him up on it? She asked. 2 men came that afternoon, Eli said. The Corey brothers. They have a property on the north side of the ridge that had a survey done 2 years ago. He paused. The survey was done by Orson Vale. She closed her eyes briefly. Get them coffee, she said. I'll be right there. The Corey brothers, Aldous and Peter, both in their 50s, both built like men who had been hauling timber since adolescence, sat at the kitchen table and looked at the survey documents Elena spread in front of them with the specific intensity of men who had been carrying a question for 2 years without knowing how to ask it. Their survey had told the bank that the North Ridge property had unstable bedrock in the primary grazing section. The bank had consequently refused to extend their credit, which had meant they could not purchase the additional cattle they needed to make the operation profitable, which had meant 2 years of barely breaking even while watching their neighbors expand. Aldous Corey pointed to the paragraph Elena indicated. Lateral water dispersion, he said. He said it slowly, the way a man said something he had memorized without intending to. I read that report 4 times trying to understand what it meant. Hired a man to explain it to me. He looked at Elena. He said it meant the water table was unreliable. It appears in 3 other survey reports, Elena said, for properties in completely different geological regions. The phrase is structurally identical in each report. The 2 brothers looked at each other. Peter Corey said, very quietly, he knew. Voss knew what that survey would do to us at the bank. Almost certainly, Elena said, another look between them. Elena had seen that kind of look before, the look of men recalibrating something they had believed about their own failure, replacing the private conviction that they had simply not been good enough with the understanding that the game had been rigged from the beginning. It was not a comfortable recalibration. It was necessary. We want in, Aldous said. I'll need your survey report and your bank correspondence, Elena said. And I need you to be prepared to testify to a territorial judge about what effect the survey finding had on your business. When? I don't know exactly. But soon. He nodded and reached into his coat and produced a folded envelope that he had brought with him, which meant he had come prepared, which meant he had already made his decision before he arrived. Elena took the envelope and added the Corey brothers to the file. 5 families now, plus Blackthorn. She wrote to Garvey that night. The families gathered at Blackthorn on a Saturday. 2 weeks before the court date, Garvey had secured with a territorial judge named Elias Lockhart, who operated out of the capital, and who Garvey had described as not a man who tolerates theater from either side. They came in over the course of the morning. Harlan Pruitt in his buckboard, the Garfield son on horseback, the Denby nephew, with his uncle's documents in a saddlebag, the Corey brothers together. They filled the main room of Blackthorn in a way that made the house feel suddenly occupied in a manner it had not been for years. Elena made coffee and set out food, and listened to the noise of people who had been isolated in their individual troubles, discovering that they were not alone in them. There was a particular moment, mid-morning, when Aldous Corey was talking to Harlan Pruitt and discovered that their surveys had been filed in the same month, despite being 20 miles apart, and the Garfield son looked at the matching paragraphs for the first time and said something sharp and unprinted, and the room went briefly quiet, and then everyone started talking at once. Elena let them talk. It was necessary. People needed to understand the scope of what had happened to them before they could commit fully to the response, and the scope was something that could only be felt properly when you were in a room with everyone else it had happened to. Calder stood at the edge of the room and watched. His shoulder was still in a partial sling, not the full one. but enough that the injury was visible, and Elena noticed several of the men looking at it, and then looking at each other with the particular expression that transferred information without words. He had been shot for this. He was still here. That communicated something that no speech could have communicated. Garvey arrived at noon, took off his coat, sat at the head of the table, and turned the gathering into a working session with the efficient precision of a man who had no time to waste on sentiment. He went through the joint complaint document, 31 pages plus addenda section by section, explaining what each piece of evidence established, what was still circumstantial, and what each family would be required to attest to personally. He was good at it. He was clear, and he did not condescend, and he did not oversell. When Harlan Pruitt asked what happened if a judge ruled against them, Garvey said that was possible, that Voss's legal team was capable, and that they should understand they were not in a guaranteed position before they put their names on anything. Nobody withdrew. When the session was over and the documents were signed, 6 sets of testimony, 1 joint complaint, the organized evidence package that Elena had spent 11 weeks constructing, Garvey looked at the table covered in papers and then at Elena. "This is better than I expected," he said. "Not as a compliment exactly. As a professional assessment. The surveys are the key," she said. "Yes. And the non-registration is publicly verifiable, which means Voss cannot simply produce documents claiming Vale is real. He has to produce a person, or admit the surveys are fraudulent." He looked at the stack. "His lawyers will try to find a way around it. We need to be prepared for that. What ways around it exist? They could argue Vale is licensed under a different jurisdiction. They could claim a clerical error in the territorial registry. They could produce someone claiming to be Vale." He paused. "That last one is the most dangerous because it turns the case into a credibility contest rather than a document contest. And in a credibility contest," Elena said, "they'll use the accusations against me." Yes, she had known this was coming. She had known it since the newspaper article ran, since the counter-accusation was filed, since she had understood that Voss's strategy was to make the case about who Elena Whitmore was, rather than what Everett Voss had done. "Then I need to speak clearly in court," she said. "Not just the documents, me." Garvey looked at her. "That's your decision, I know," she said. "It's the right one." Voss moved 4 days before the court date. He moved the way he always moved, through official channels, with lawyers, with the appearance of legitimate process wrapped around something designed to obstruct. A filing arrived at the territorial court claiming that the joint complaint was improperly assembled, that the complaints lacked standing to bring a unified case, and that the evidence had been collected and organized by a person, Elena Whitmore, who was herself the subject of pending accusations and therefore a compromised party. It was technically creative. Garvey spent an evening drafting the response and did not look pleased while he was doing it. "He's trying to separate you from the case," Garvey told Elena that night. "If he can establish that the evidence was contaminated by your involvement, he can challenge the admissibility of the entire document package. Can he succeed? Judge Lockhart will decide that. But Lockhart is not an idiot, and this is transparently strategic." He set down his pen. "The response I'm filing argues that you are a witness and an organizer, not the legal complainant. The families are the complainants. Your involvement in gathering evidence is no different from any attorney conducting discovery." "Is that argument solid?" "Solid enough," Garvey said, which was not a yes, and they both knew it. Calder came in from the hallway. He had heard enough to understand the problem. He sat at the table and looked at the papers and said nothing for a moment, and then he said, "What does he actually want from all of this? What is Voss's real objective to own this land corridor?" Elena said. She had been thinking about this for weeks, mapping it. "The properties he's acquired form a line from the eastern ridge down to the valley floor. If he completes the acquisition, Blackthorn is the largest piece. The anchor, he controls the primary water access for the northern half of the territory." "Water," Calder said. "There's talk of railroad expansion," Elena said. "A spur line through the valley. Water rights along the route will be worth considerably more than the land itself in 10 years. She looked at him. "He's not buying ranches. He's buying what the ranches sit on top of." Calder was quiet for a moment. "You figured this out." The corporate structure pointed to it. "The shell companies have investors. I found some of the names through public filings at the Capitol. Some of those investors are connected to the Railroad Committee." She spread the relevant pages. "It's not provable as a direct conspiracy yet, but it explains why he's moved so aggressively and why he can afford to." Garvey leaned forward and looked at the pages. His expression shifted. "If we can establish the railroad connection," he said slowly, "the scale of the fraud changes. This becomes not just land theft from individual families. This becomes market manipulation involving territorial infrastructure, which is a different category of criminal exposure," Elena said. "A considerably different one." Garvey looked at her. How solid is this? The investor names are solid public filings. The railroad committee connection is solid. The direct link between the committee and the acquisition strategies is inferential. She looked at him directly. It's enough to ask the question in court. It may not be enough to prove the answer. In front of Lockhart, Garvey said, asking the right question is often enough. They rode to the territorial capital on a Tuesday, the day before the hearing, because the road was long, and Calder was not going to make that ride and arrive depleted. Elena went. Garvey went. Calder went with his shoulder not fully healed, and the look of a man who had been inside walls of his grief for 2 years, and was now riding deliberately out of them. Harlan Pruitt came. The Corey brothers came. The Garfield son and the Denby nephew came. They rode in a group that was not quite a procession, but carried that quality people who had been separated by fear and distance, now moving together towards something. Elena rode beside Calder for most of the day. They did not talk much. There was something about the ride itself that did not require conversation, the landscape moving around them, the shared understanding of where they were going and what it would cost if it went wrong. At one point, maybe 3 hours in, Calder said, "You've been doing this for 11 weeks. Doing what specifically?" she said. All of it, the file, the letters, the families. Building something out of nothing. He looked at the road ahead. "When you walked in through that gate with your suitcase, I hired you to cook." "You hired me to cook and keep accounts," she said. "That's not what this is." "No," she agreed, "it's not." He was quiet for a moment. "I want you to know something. For tomorrow. Whatever happens in that room," he kept his eyes on the road. "I would have lost Blackthorn without you. Not to the courts. To myself. I was losing it before you came, just letting it run down, letting the accounts drift, letting things go because I didn't see the point of holding them." He paused. "You brought the point back." Elena looked at the road. "Calder," she said carefully, "don't tell me things like that the day before a court hearing." He looked at her then, and she looked back, and there was a moment between them that was not ambiguous, even though neither of them said anything else about it. Then she faced forward, and they kept riding, and the conversation moved on to practical things, and the thing that had been acknowledged stayed acknowledged without needing to be examined further just yet. There was tomorrow first. The territorial court building was stone, which was either deliberate or coincidental, but it produced the effect of permanence and weight in a way that a frame building could not have managed. Judge Elias Lockhart's courtroom was on the second floor, and the room was smaller than Elena had imagined, not a grand hall, but a working space, with benches for observers that were already partly filled when they arrived. Voss was there. She had not seen him since the land office years ago, and she looked at him with the careful attention of someone examining a thing they had been studying indirectly for months. He was, as she remembered, silver-templed, well-dressed, wearing the specific case of a man who was comfortable in rooms like this. He was flanked by 2 attorneys, both of whom radiated the expensive efficiency of men who did not lose often. He looked at Elena across the room. It was brief, assessing. And then he looked away, which told her he had made the same calculation about her, that he had always made, that she was not the primary concern, that Calder was the landowner and therefore the real party, that Elena Whitmore was an instrument rather than a force. She filed that away. Garvey arranged their materials at the table with practiced efficiency. Elena sat beside him and Calder sat on her other side, and the families arranged themselves in the observer benches behind them, which was technically unusual, but which Garvey had cleared in advance with the court clerk, framing them as witnesses who needed to be accessible. Judge Lockhart entered at precisely 9 o'clock. He was in his late 60s, lean and deliberate, with the kind of face that had stopped finding theater interesting several decades ago. He sat. He looked at both tables. He looked at the room. "I've reviewed the preliminary filings from both parties," he said. His voice was dry and even, and carried without effort. "I'll tell both sides now that I don't intend to spend this proceeding on procedure. The motion to exclude the joint complaint on grounds of contaminated assembly is denied. The complainants are the families of record. The organizational work is discovery. We'll proceed on the substance." He looked at Voss's table. "You'll have your opportunities. Let's not waste the court's time getting to them." Voss's lead attorney, a man named Hargrove, who Elena had heard described as formidable, made a brief expression of displeasure that he controlled immediately. It was a small thing, that opening ruling. But Elena felt the shift in the room when it landed. Garvey opened the case methodically. He did not perform. He presented the timeline, the surveys, the Territorial Land Authority confirmation that Orson Vale was not a registered geologist, the matching language across multiple documents for different properties, the pattern of debt acquisition and commercial disruption that followed each fraudulent survey. He spoke for 2 hours with the patient precision of someone laying a foundation, and what he built was not dramatic, but it was solid. Hargrove responded by attacking the edges. The corporate connection was inferential, he argued. The matching language could be coincidence or common industry phrasing. The non-registration of Vale was a clerical matter that his client was not responsible for. He was skilled, he found the weak points with accuracy. Then he did what Elena had known he would do. He began talking about Elena. The entire evidentiary structure presented today, Hargrove said, was assembled by a woman with direct personal grievances against my client. A woman who lost her property through legitimate debt proceedings, who subsequently placed herself in the household of the primary complainant, and who has every motive to construct a narrative that recasts her own losses as someone else's wrongdoing. He paused. The court should weigh the evidence accordingly. Lockhart looked at him. Mr. Hargrove, the evidence either holds up to examination or it doesn't. Who found it is a separate question. With respect, Your Honor, the manner in which evidence is assembled affects the Territorial Land Authority's confirmation that Orson Vale is not registered, Lockhart said, was not assembled by Mrs. Whitmore. It was provided by the territorial government in response to a public records request. Do you have an argument about that specific document? A pause. We argue that a licensing oversight produced Mr. Vale, Lockhart said, or produced documentation of his credentials. If he is a licensed geologist who has surveyed 6 properties in this territory over 4 years, producing him should not be difficult. The room was very quiet. Hargrove said that producing Mr. Vale on short notice was not something his client had been prepared to, and Lockhart stopped him. Mr. Hargrove, your client filed a countermotion 9 days ago. He has had time to prepare whatever he intended to present today. Does your client have Orson Vale available to verify his credentials or not? Another pause. A consultation brief and quiet between Hargrove and the second attorney. We are prepared to address the survey question through documentation, Hargrove said. That's not what I asked. The documentation Hargrove produced was a certificate of geological licensure from a neighboring territory, issued to one Orson Vale, dated 2 years after the first survey bearing that name had been filed. It was the kind of document that was designed to be convincing at a distance. Garvey stood, examined it, and said in the tone of a man who had anticipated this specifically, Your Honor, this certificate is dated 18 months after the first Blackthorn survey and over 2 years after the first Garfield survey. If Mr. Vale was not licensed in this territory at the time the surveys were filed, the licensure is irrelevant to whether the surveys were legal. Lockhart looked at the certificate. He looked at the dates of the surveys on the complaint. He made a note. Then he looked at Elena's table. Mrs. Whitmore, he said, I understand you wish to speak to the evidence directly. She stood. She had not prepared a speech. She had prepared a sequence of facts organized in the order they needed to be understood, with the documents to support each one. She had learned from 12 years of keeping accounts that clarity was more persuasive than eloquence, and that a fact stated simply and supported visibly was harder to argue with than a fact wrapped in language. She presented the matching paragraphs first, laying 3 survey reports on the clerk's table side by side so Lockhart could see them himself. She explained Eli's discovery of the matching technical measurements from different geological zones. She walked through the timeline of events at each targeted property, the survey, the bank difficulty, the commercial disruption, the eventual approach to sell. She presented the corporate structure connecting the acquisitions to Voss's attorney without overstating what was proven. Then she said, Your Honor, I am a widow who was displaced from her property through a debt mechanism that I believe was deliberately engineered. I have a personal stake in this outcome, and I won't pretend otherwise. But the documents on that table did not come from my grievance. They came from the territorial government, from bank records, from property filings that are publicly available to anyone who looks. She looked at the judge. I looked. That's the difference. She sat down. Lockhart had been watching her with the expression of a man who had heard a considerable number of people speak in this room and was deciding what category she belonged in. He called the first family witness. They went one by one. Harlan, Aldous Corey, the Garfield son, the Denby nephew. Each described their survey, the subsequent financial impact, the pattern that matched what the others had experienced. Hargrove cross-examined each one with skill, probing for inconsistencies, finding the places where memory was uncertain or records were incomplete. He was good. Elena watched him work and acknowledged privately that he was good. But there were 6 of them, and the documents did not have memories that could be made uncertain. It was mid-afternoon when Lockhart set down his pen and looked at Voss's table. Mr. Voss, he said, your attorneys have argued that the survey irregularities are either coincidental or clerical. They have argued that the complainants lack sufficient evidence of coordinated fraud. They have produced a certificate of licensure that postdates the earliest filed surveys by over 2 years. He paused. I am now going to give you a direct opportunity. Produce Orson Vale in person to testify to his qualifications and to his conduct of the surveys in question. If he is a real person who performed legitimate work, his presence resolves this. The room was very still. Hargrove leaned toward Voss. A brief, very quiet exchange. Then Hargrove said, "Your Honor, Mr. Vale is currently unavailable to appear." "Unavailable," Lockhart repeated. "He is traveling. We were not given sufficient." Mr. Hargrove Lockhart's voice had not risen. It had simply become more final. 6 property surveys filed in this territory over 4 years, bearing the name of an individual who cannot be produced in person, whose licensure predates none of the surveys in question, whose name does not appear in the territorial registry, and whose survey reports contain identical language and identical technical measurements across properties with demonstrably different geological characteristics. He looked at both tables. "I am not finding in favor of fraud today. I am finding that the evidence presented by the complainants establishes sufficient cause for a full territorial investigation into the surveys, the acquisitions, and the related business practices." He made a note. The counter-accusations against Mrs. Whitmore and Mr. Rusk are dismissed for lack of supporting evidence. The fraudulent survey filings, and I am using that term advisedly, are invalidated pending investigation. Any business transactions dependent on those survey findings are suspended. He looked at Hargrove. "Your client will have the opportunity to provide documentation and testimony during the investigation. I would strongly advise him to cooperate." Voss's face had not changed visibly. He was a controlled man, and he was controlling himself now. But his attorneys were writing fast, and the second attorney had a look of someone recalculating a position significantly. Garvey, beside Elena, let out a breath that was not quite audible. Harlan Pruitt, in the bench behind her, put his hand briefly on her shoulder. She did not turn around. She sat very still and looked at the front of the room and let the ruling settle into her, let it become real and solid and present. It was not a complete victory. She knew it was not a complete victory. The investigation was not a conviction, and Voss had resources to fight an investigation for years. But the fraudulent surveys were invalidated. The charges against her were dismissed. The coordinated targeting of 6 families had been placed before a territorial judge and had not been explained away. The mechanism was broken, not destroyed, but broken. Outside the courthouse in the afternoon light, the families gathered on the steps without quite planning to. Harlan Pruitt shook Garvey's hand. The Corey brothers looked at each other with the expression of men who had just set down something they had been carrying for 2 years. The Garfield son said something short and sincere to Calder, who listened and responded with the directness he always brought to things that mattered. Elena stood slightly apart, looking at the street. Calder came and stood beside her. "Not close enough to be remarked on. Close enough to be present. It's not over," she said. "No," he agreed. "But it's different now." She looked at the courthouse behind them. 31 pages, 11 weeks, $63, and a battered suitcase, and 8 miles of road in July, leading here to a stone courthouse in the territorial capital, to a judge who had looked at the evidence and found it sufficient. "Are you all right?" Calder said. She thought about it honestly. "I will be," she said. "Give me a minute." He gave her the minute. He stood beside her in the afternoon light while the others talked around them, and he did not rush her. And she stood there and let herself feel the full weight of what had just happened, the relief and the exhaustion and the specific ache of something that had been wound tight for months, beginning very slowly to release. Then she straightened. She picked up her bag. She looked at the road. "Let's go home," she said. It was the first time she could call Blackthorn that. She heard it as she said it. Calder heard it too. She knew he did from the way his eyes moved briefly to her face. He said nothing about it. He simply fell into step beside her, and they walked toward the horses, and the families followed. And the road back to Blackthorn was long, but it was no longer the road toward something uncertain. The road back to Blackthorn took most of the day, and by the time the main house came into view in the late afternoon light, Elena was tired in a way that went considerably deeper than physical. It was the tiredness that came after a long tension finally released, not pleasant, exactly, but honest. The kind of exhaustion that meant something real had happened, and the body was accounting for it. Eli was waiting at the gate. He had stayed behind to manage the ranch in their absence, which was the first time Calder had left him in full charge of anything, and Elena could see from 20 yards away that he had taken it seriously. The yard was neat. The horses were fed. Smoke was coming from the kitchen chimney, which meant he had attempted dinner, which was either brave or optimistic, depending on what was actually in the pot. He looked at their faces as they rode in and read them the way young men read the faces of people they trusted, searching for the headline before anyone spoke. Calder dismounted and handed him the reins. "The charges are dismissed," he said. "The surveys are invalidated. There's an investigation opening." Eli stood there for a moment, holding the reins. Then he said, "All of it?" "Enough of it," Calder said. For now, Eli looked at Elena. She nodded once. He turned away quickly. the way young men turned away when something moved them, and they hadn't yet developed the facility for letting it show, and he busied himself with the horse with great unnecessary thoroughness. Elena went inside and found that he had made a creditable attempt at beef stew that was slightly oversalted and genuinely well-intentioned, and she ate 2 bowls of it without comment because it was food made by someone who had cared enough to try, and that counted for more than the salt. The investigation did not move quickly. Territorial investigations never did, and Voss had lawyers who understood how to make slowness work in their client's favor. There were motions and counter-motions and requests for extension that Garvey navigated with the patient efficiency of a man who had expected all of it. He wrote to Elena every 2 weeks with an update, and she wrote back, and the correspondence became one more thing she managed alongside the accounts and the kitchen and the slow, steady work of keeping Blackthorn operational. Calder's shoulder healed. Not perfectly, Dr. Holt had told him. The joint would give him trouble in cold weather for the rest of his life. And Calder had received this information with the philosophical acceptance of a man who had already collected a fair number of permanent reminders from his years of living hard. But the sling came off in 6 weeks, and by the 8th week he was working full days again, which Elena had opinions about that she kept mostly to herself. Mostly. "You're favoring it," she said one evening, when he came in from the stable moving in a way that was not quite right. "I'm fine," he said. "You're favoring it and you've been out there for 4 hours. He sat down at the table with the particular care of a man who was not going to admit that sitting down carefully was its own kind of admission. "It's manageable, that's not what I said." He looked at her. There was something between them now that had been building for weeks and had not yet been named but had changed the quality of ordinary conversations in a way that both of them were aware of, and neither had yet decided to address directly. It made the small exchanges carry more weight than they had before the courthouse. "Elena," he said with the quiet exasperation of a man who was not accustomed to being looked after and was finding it both irritating and something else he couldn't quite name. "I've been running this ranch since I was 26. "I'm aware," she said. "Sit there and I'll bring you something hot." He sat there. She brought him something hot. He drank it without further argument, which was its own form of communication. The first concrete consequence of the investigation arrived 10 weeks after the courthouse, in a letter from Garvey that Elena read at the kitchen table on a Tuesday morning while the coffee was still fresh. The territorial investigation had subpoenaed the corporate records of the 3 shell companies connected to Voss's acquisitions. The records had been produced under protest and with significant redaction, but what remained visible confirmed what Elena had inferred from the public filings. The holding companies shared investors, shared legal representation, and had been used in a coordinated pattern of property acquisition across the territory. 2 of those investors were members of the Territorial Railroad Committee. The railroad connection, which she had mapped from inference in public records, was now documented in subpoenaed corporate files. Garvey's letter was careful and precise in its language, as always. But between the careful, precise sentences she could read something that was less measured. He was, professionally and quietly, pleased. A second letter came the following week from the Territorial Attorney General's office, addressed to Calder, informing him that the criminal referral attached to the territorial court ruling had been accepted and that formal charges were being prepared against Everett Voss for fraud, conspiracy to defraud, filing false documents with a territorial authority, and commission of assault, the shooting on the road, for which 2 of Voss's hired men had, under investigation pressure, provided testimony that connected the order to their employer. Elena read that letter twice. She thought about the man at the gate, the one with the 2 clean trail clothes, and the message about reasonable decisions. She thought about the hay barn in the dark, the orange light against the black sky, Eli's voice from the loft. She thought about Calder coming out of the east door with Eli's arm around his neck, and the burn already working its way across his palm. She folded the letter and put it with Garvey's in the satchel that was no longer under her bed because there was no longer any reason to keep it hidden. It sat on the study shelf now, properly filed, the kind of document collection that belonged in a room where business was conducted, rather than a room where a woman slept with one ear toward the yard. She told Calder that evening at dinner. He read both letters with the same stillness he brought to everything important, and when he finished he set them on the table and looked at the window for a moment. "It'll still take time," he said. "Yes," she said. "But it's moving," he nodded slowly. "The family should know. I'll write to them tonight." He folded the letters along their original creases. He looked at her across the table. "You know what this started as? A records request and 3 survey reports. You in a notebook," he said. At midnight at this table, she looked at the table. She had spent a considerable number of midnights at it. She knew the grain of the wood in the lamplight better than she knew most surfaces in the world. "It started before that," she said. It started when Harlan Pruitt rode up to my fence line and took off his hat. Calder was quiet for a moment. And you packed a list. I always pack a list. Something moved across his face, something that was not quite a smile but occupied the same neighborhood. It was an expression she had come to know well over the past months, the one that appeared when something she said aligned with something he thought about her that he had not yet said aloud. She was beginning to understand that Calder Rusk said a great many things without using words. She had started very carefully to say things back the same way. It was Eli who found her in the study 2 weeks later, standing in front of the door at the end of the hall. She had not planned to be standing there. She had come to put a file away, and had passed the door and stopped, as she sometimes did, with the particular awareness of a space that carried weight. The door had been locked since before she arrived at Blackthorn. Eli had told her early on that it had been Margaret's room, a sitting room she had used as her own, separate from the shared spaces, where she had kept her sewing and her books and whatever privacy a woman managed, inside a working household. After she died, Calder had locked it and not unlocked it, and the hands had learned to walk past it without remarking on it. Elena had done the same. It was not her door. It was not her grief. Eli appeared at the end of the hall and saw her standing there and looked uncertain about whether to retreat. I wasn't trying to open it, Elena said without turning around. I was just standing here, I know, he said. He came down the hall and stood beside her. He was as good young man Eli. She had thought so from the first week, and the month since had confirmed it. He had a quality of attentiveness that was rare in someone his age, a genuine interest in the people around him that was not performance. Do you think he'll ever open it? She said. Eli considered this with the seriousness she'd learned to expect from him. I think he might, he said, if the right thing happened. She looked at the door for another moment. Then she went back to work. Calder opened the door on a Sunday in late October. Elena did not know he was going to do it. She did not find out until afterward, from the sound a key in a lock, which was specific enough to be identifiable even from the kitchen, and then a silence that was different from ordinary silence, the silence of a room that had been closed for a long time being open to air. She stayed in the kitchen. She heard him in there for about an hour. She did not go near the hall. She made bread because it was Sunday, and because the work of bread, the specific physical, requiring attention, was useful when she needed to let something be without reaching toward it. When he came out, he came to the kitchen. He did not say anything immediately. He poured coffee and stood at the window in the way he sometimes did when he was working through something that he had not yet found the words for. She shaped the dough and waited. She had good taste, he said finally. In books, I'd forgotten that. He looked at the coffee. She had 3 shelves. I don't know why I'd let myself forget what she read. Elena kept working the dough. What had she read? History, mostly, and 1 shelf of novels she'd never have admitted to out loud. A pause. She would have liked you. Elena stopped. She stood at the kitchen counter with flour on her hands and did not know for a moment how to respond to that. It was not a simple sentence. It was not a transition or a pleasantry. It was a man saying something that had cost him something to say, and she understood the weight of it precisely because she understood how much of himself he kept banked, controlled, not offered freely. That she started. I mean it, he said, not as a compliment to you or a comfort to me. I mean it as a fact. He turned from the window. She was practical and she was sharp, and she didn't have patience for people who weren't honest. She would have liked you. Elena looked at him. Calder, she said. What are you doing? I'm drinking coffee, he said, and telling you something that's true. You're doing more than that. He set the cup down. He was a large man in a kitchen that fit him imperfectly. He had always been slightly too much for rooms, his size requiring everything to adjust around him, and yet she had stopped noticing the size in the way she'd noticed it the first day. What she noticed now was the specific quality of the way he held himself when he was saying something real, the slight forward shift of his weight, the directness of his eyes. I don't have a graceful way to say this, he said. I've been working on one for about 3 months, and I don't have it. Then say it without grace, she said. He looked at her across the kitchen. Stay, he said, not as the cook, not as the accountant. I want you to stay as my wife. The kitchen was very quiet. Outside, the October wind was moving through the trees at the edge of the property, the sound of it familiar and constant, something she had been listening to for 4 months, without knowing she would come to associate it with this place and this life. She looked at him. She thought about being honest, which was the only thing she knew how to be. I am not easy to live with, she said. Keep accounts in my head at all times. I will argue with you when I think you're wrong. I work late, and I wake early, and I am not going to stop being the size I am because some people in this territory think it warrants commentary. I know, he said. I love my husband, she said. I'm not going to pretend I didn't, and I'm not going to apologize for it. I know that too. He held her gaze steadily. I'm not asking you to be something other than what you are. I'm asking you to be what you are here, with me. She looked at the dough under her hands. She looked at the kitchen that she had spent 4 months making functional, and then gradually making something else making it. If she was honest, into the kitchen she would have wanted if she had been asked. The stove that she had coaxed into even heat. The organized stores. The good cups that now came out regularly rather than sitting in the cabinet for visitors who needed impressing. She had not let herself see it until now. She had been making this place hers without acknowledging that was what she was doing. Yes, she said. He crossed the kitchen in 2 strides, and she turned, and he put both hands on her face, the scarred right hand and the unscathed left. And he looked at her for a moment with the specific look of a man who was still surprised that something this good had walked through his gate with a battered suitcase. And then he kissed her, once, with the particular care of a man who understood that some things were worth doing without rushing. She put flower handprints on both his shoulders. He did not remark on it. They married in December, at Blackthorn, in the yard where the hay barn had stood before the fire. The new barn frame was already up Calder, and the hands had begun it in November, and the Corey brothers had come 2 weekends to help, and Harlan Pruitt had sent timber, and the framing gave the yard a shape it hadn't had before, an open geometry of new wood against the winter sky. It was cold. Elena had not planned for a warm wedding and did not particularly need one. Warmth was a thing she associated with kitchens and lamplit evenings and coffee at midnight, not with ceremonies. Garvey came, Harlan and his wife came. The Corey brothers came with their families. The Garfield son came, and the Denby nephew, and 2 of the other families from the territorial case, who had heard about the wedding through the particular informal network that had developed over the past months among people who had shared something difficult. Eli stood beside Calder. He had been given the formal position of ranch foreman 3 weeks earlier, an overdue recognition that Calder made without fanfare, and that Eli received with the careful composure of a young man who was learning not to show everything he felt. He had grown, Elena thought, watching him not in the physical sense, but in the other one. The fire had done something to him that could not be undone. It had shown him what he was made of, and he had been quietly rearranging himself around that knowledge ever since. The ceremony was brief because neither Elena nor Calder had patience for length, and the man who performed it was a justice of the peace from the county seat, who understood this from the way they stood and kept to the essentials. When it was done, and what followed was food and people, and the particular noise of a house that had been quiet for too long filling up with voices. Elena stood in her own kitchen, Blackthorn's kitchen, their kitchen in December, with the fire going properly, and the good cups out and bread she had made that morning because she had wanted to make it, not because it was her job. And she looked at the room full of people, and she thought about Franklin. She gave herself that moment. She always gave herself that moment. He had been a good man and a good husband, and he had died in a field doing work he loved. And she was not going to arrive at the end of one life and the beginning of another without acknowledging the life in between. She stood at the edge of the kitchen and was grateful for what she'd had, and sorry for what had ended and present in what was here, all at once, because life did not separate those things into tidy categories, no matter how much it would be convenient if it did. Harlan's wife appeared at her elbow. She was a small, sturdy woman named Cecily who had not said much to Elena in the months of the legal proceedings, but who had, Elena suspected, been paying close attention throughout. "He's watching you," Cecily said. Without looking, Elena knew who she meant. "He does that," Elena said. "My Harlan took 4 years to figure out what that man figured out in about 4 months. Cecily said it with the dry affection of a woman who had made her peace with her husband's pace of reasoning. Good for him. Elena looked across the room at Calder, who was talking to the Corey brothers about the new barn framing, and was, in fact, simultaneously watching her with the peripheral attention of a man who had spent months learning her position in a room. She looked back at Cecily. "He's not an easy man," she said. "No," Cecily agreed. "But the easy ones don't build anything that lasts." The territorial criminal proceedings against Everett Voss concluded the following spring. He was convicted on 3 of 5 counts, fraud against a territorial authority, filing false documents, and conspiracy. The assault charge, the shooting on the road, resulted in a hung jury on Voss's personal culpability, though the 2 hired men were convicted. His attorneys managed to construct enough distance between their client and the direct order that the jury could not reach unanimity. Elena read the verdict in a letter from Garvey and felt the familiar dissatisfaction of an outcome that was true but incomplete. He had not walked away. He had lost a great deal. The shell companies were dissolved. The fraudulent acquisitions were unwound where, legally possible, his reputation in the territory was damaged in a way that money could slow but not reverse. He would not be building a water rights empire on the back of forged surveys. But he was not in prison, and she had believed he should be. She said as much to Calder, who read the letter after her, and was quiet for a moment. "It's not nothing," he said. "I know it's not nothing." The Garfields get their land back, he said. The Denbys get their water access restored. The Corey brothers can go back to the bank with clean survey records. I know, she said. I just wanted more. He looked at her with the steady look she had come to know as his version of understanding something he could not fix. That's reasonable, he said. Wanting more than you got doesn't mean what you got isn't real. She looked at the letter. He'll move somewhere else. Different territory. Different name for the holding company. Different families. Maybe, Calder said. Or maybe a man who's been convicted of fraud and had his business structure dismantled in public finds it harder to operate the next time. Maybe the next family he targets has heard about this and knows to look. She considered that. You're more optimistic than I am. I have more reason to be, he said with a quiet directness that settled the sentence without closing it. She put the letter in the satchel, the final entry in the document collection that had begun with a records request, and 3 matching paragraphs, and had ended, as well as things like this ended, with a verdict that was partial and real, and would have to be enough. The locked room at the end of the hall was no longer locked. Elena had not changed it dramatically. That had not been the intention, and it would not have been right. Margaret's books were still on the shelves. She had dusted them and kept them in order, but had not removed them, because they were part of what the room was and what the room had meant. But the window was open now when the weather allowed, and there was a lamp on the table that Elena used in the evenings when she wanted to read somewhere quiet, and gradually the room had become what a room becomes when someone lives in a house fully, a place that was used, that held the past without being imprisoned by it. Calder came in sometimes and took a book from Margaret's shelf. He did it the way he did most things, without announcing it, without making it a statement. Just a man taking a book from a room that used to be closed and reading it at the kitchen table, while his wife worked on the accounts across from him. Elena had learned to see this for what it was. Not closure, exactly. She did not believe in closure as a completed state, had never believed that grief was something that ended rather than something that changed shape. What she saw was a man who had stopped using his loss as a reason to absent himself from his own life. He was present. In the evenings, in the kitchen, on the property, in the way he talked to Eli, and the hands and the families who came to Blackthorn, with increasing frequency as the community that had formed around the legal case became something more durable. That community was one of the things Elena had not anticipated. She had built it as a tactical necessity, united complainants, shared evidence, collective standing in court. She had not expected it to persist past the verdict, but it had. The families wrote to each other. The Corey brothers had started a joint grazing arrangement with Harlan Pruitt that made both operations more efficient. The Garfields' eldest son had come back to the territory after the land was restored, and had started working with Eli on a cattle arrangement with Blackthorn that gave both operations more flexibility. People who had been isolated in their individual struggles had discovered that the connection they'd made under pressure was useful in ordinary life too, that it made things lighter to have people who knew what you'd been through, who didn't need the story explained. Elena managed the Blackthorn accounts with a precision that had, over the months, extended into something broader. She had begun helping the Corey brothers with their records, and then the Denby family, and then Harlan Pruitt's operation, in an informal capacity that had no name and required no title. She simply knew how to find the things that were wrong before they became serious, and people who had learned that lesson the hard way were willing to be helped. Calder watched this expand and did not question it. He had, Elena thought, always known what she was. He had seen it in the first week, when she had found the seed supplier overcharge in an evening's work, and he had been adjusting his understanding of the ranch's possibilities around that knowledge ever since. She appreciated that about him. She appreciated it more than she had language for. The winter was hard, the way winters in that territory were hard, with cold that came early and stayed too long and tested fences and animals and the patience of everyone responsible for both. Elena was pregnant by November, which she confirmed with the calm assessment of a woman who had learned to take the facts of her life as they arrived and work with them rather than being surprised by them. She told Calder on a Tuesday evening at the kitchen table, between the accounts and the coffee, because dramatic settings had never been her idiom. He looked at her for a moment with an expression she had not seen on him before, not surprise exactly, because they were not people who had been inattentive to what their life together might produce, but something deeper than surprise, something that started in his chest and moved upward before he had the chance to manage it. "Are you all right?" he said. "First thing." "I'm fine," she said. "Tired. Some mornings are difficult. It'll pass." He nodded. He was trying to organize himself and not doing it as efficiently as usual. "Calder," she said, with the specific gentleness she reserved for moments when his size and his self-control were both temporarily inadequate to contain whatever he was feeling. "Say what you're thinking." He looked at the table. He looked at her. I thought I'd lost the chance for this, he said. After Margaret. After the baby, he stopped. I told myself I'd made my peace with it. Had you? No, he said simply. I just stopped hoping for it. She reached across the table and put her hand over the scarred right hand, the one with the burn scar across the palm from the burning ladder, from the night he had gone into the barn for Eli without stopping to calculate the cost. She had learned this hand well over the months, the way it felt different from the other, the specific geography of what the fire had left behind. Well, she said, now you don't have to. He turned his hand over and held hers, and neither of them said anything else for a while, and the lamp burned on the table between them, and outside the winter was doing what winter did, and inside the kitchen was warm. Their daughter was born in late March, during the particular week when winter and spring were still arguing about which one had jurisdiction over the territory, with cold nights and mornings that smelled like something new was coming, even if it hadn't arrived yet. She was born healthy and loud, and with an immediate, emphatic opinion about being in the world that Elena recognized as familiar, and Calder recognized as something he was going to have to learn to manage, which he did not seem displeased about. They named her Clara. Eli held her first, after Calder, with the careful uncertainty of a young man who had not held an infant before, and was applying the same focused attention to it that he applied to things he had decided mattered. He held her like something he was responsible for not breaking. And Clara stared up at him with the unfocused intensity of a person encountering the world for the first time, and Eli looked at her face and then looked at Elena with an expression she was going to remember for a long time. She's very small, he said. She'll get bigger, Elena said. I know, he looked back at the baby. I just meant he stopped. He was not always able to finish the sentences that began when something caught him honestly. It's a lot, he said. That she's here it is, Elena agreed. Harlan Pruitt and Cecily came 2 days later and brought food, which was the correct instinct and the most useful gift. The Corey brothers came the following week. The Garfield son sent a letter with a gift for the baby, and a note that was brief and genuine in the way of a man who had learned that brevity was not the same as insufficient feeling. The ranch in the spring had a quality that Elena had not known it was missing until it arrived. Noise. Not the functional noise of a working operation that had always been there, but the specific noise of a place where people lived fully. Clara crying at 3 a.m. Eli arguing with one of the other hands about the right way to mend a section of fence. Calder's voice from the stable, talking to a horse, in the low, deliberate way he talked to things he was trying not to startle. The sound of multiple people at a kitchen table, eating food that was made for them by someone who made it because they wanted to. It was not a perfect life. Elena had not been looking for a perfect life and would not have known what to do with one. The investigation had resolved as well as investigations like that resolved, which was imperfectly. The territory was still the territory, with all the complications of land and money, and people who had more of both than they deserved. Calder's shoulder gave him trouble in the cold, and sometimes she woke in the night and heard him moving through the house at an hour that meant he was not sleeping, and she knew that grief did not resolve cleanly any more than legal proceedings did. It simply became something a person lived alongside rather than inside. What she had was this: a kitchen that was hers, accounts that were in order, a community of people who knew what they owed each other. A young man who had walked out of a burning barn and grown into someone she was glad to know. A husband who had opened a locked door and had not locked it again. A daughter who was loud and present and entirely herself from her first moment in the world. And she had for herself the specific knowledge that she had walked 8 miles on a July afternoon with $63 and a battered suitcase and a list of what she had packed, and that the list had mattered, and that the walking had mattered, and that the refusal to sit down at the side of the road when the heat and the weight and the unfairness of everything had made sitting down seem reasonable that had mattered most of all. She had been told, her whole life in various ways and tones and by various people who thought they were being accurate, that a woman who looked like her and had what she had did not get to expect much, that the world would give her what was left over after everyone else had been considered, and she should be grateful for it. What she had learned, and what she carried now as a settled fact rather than an argument she had to keep making, was that the world did not actually determine what a person got. Not entirely. Not finally. The world set the conditions and the obstacles and the Everett Voses and the Lenora Vases and the letters with ugly insinuations in them. But the walking was hers. The list was hers. The 11 weeks of work at a kitchen table at midnight. The letter to the land authority. The 31 pages, those were hers. You could take someone's land. You could take their credit and their livestock contracts and their reputation in the county newspaper. You could shoot at them on the open road and burn their barn in the dark. What you could not take was the specific quality of a person who did not stop. Elena Whitmore, Elena Rusk. Now, though she used both names as the occasion required, stood in the kitchen of Blackthorn Ranch on a spring afternoon, with Clara on her hip and flour on her hands, and the accounts open on the table and the window letting in the smell of something that had finally, definitively turned toward warmth. And the door at the end of the hall was open, and it stayed open,